Silas Vane was a tall man with a tired face and strong hands. He walked through the busy streets of Tortuga. The sun was very hot, and the air smelled like salt and dry wood. Many people were in the market. They were talking loudly and moving quickly. Silas did not look at them. He wanted to find something special today. He saw a small shop at the end of a narrow street. The shop was dark and dusty. The windows were dirty, and it was hard to see inside. He opened the heavy wooden door. The door moved against the floor. Inside, the shop was full of old things. There were broken clocks, rusty swords, and dirty maps. The air was thick with the smell of old paper. An old man sat behind a wooden table. He had a long white beard and many lines on his face. He did not look up when Silas entered. Silas started to look at the shelves. He touched a piece of old rope and moved some glass bottles. He looked at every object with care. Then, he saw a small wooden box. It was under a heavy pile of old, grey clothes. Silas moved the clothes and opened the box. Inside, there was a single coin. It was not like the coins in the market. It was very large and made of heavy yellow gold. It had a strange picture of a snake on it. The snake was curved in a circle, and it had a small green stone for an eye. Silas felt the weight of the coin in his hand. It was much heavier than it looked. He used his thumb to rub the dirt off the metal. The gold began to shine in the dim light of the shop. Silas felt a strange excitement in his chest. He knew this coin was very old and very important. "How much is this?" Silas asked. His voice was deep and calm. The old man finally looked up. His eyes were small, dark, and very sharp. He saw the coin in Silas's hand and stayed silent for a long time. Then, he spoke in a quiet, thin voice. "That coin is from a place that does not exist on any map, Captain. It is the start of a dangerous story. Many people have died for that piece of gold." Silas looked at the snake on the coin. He did not look afraid. "I like stories," he said. He took some silver from his pocket and put it on the table. The silver hit the wood. The old man took the silver and nodded his head slowly. "Take it, then. But be careful. The sea is wide, but secrets have a way of finding people. Others will see that shine, and they will follow you." Silas put the golden coin into his leather bag. He felt the cold metal through the leather. He walked out of the shop and back into the bright sunlight. He looked at the ocean in the distance. The adventure was starting. Silas walked away from the market and toward the quieter part of the port. The sun was lower in the sky now, and the shadows were long. He reached a small building made of white stone. Above the door, a wooden sign showed a picture of a star and a compass. This was the office of the best navigator in Tortuga. He pushed the door open. Inside, the room was cool and smelled like dry ink and expensive leather. Large maps covered the walls. Some maps showed the Caribbean Sea, while others showed faraway places like Africa and Asia. A woman was sitting at a large desk in the center of the room. She was wearing a dark blue coat and had her black hair tied back tightly. This was Elena. She was famous for her ability to find any location on the ocean. Elena did not look up from her work. She was using a small tool to measure a distance on a paper map. The tool moved against the thick paper. "I am busy, Captain Vane," she said. Her voice was steady and professional. "If you want a map of the trade routes, come back tomorrow." Silas walked closer to the desk. He did not say anything. He took the golden coin from his bag and placed it on top of her map. The heavy metal landed on the desk. Elena stopped moving. She looked at the coin for a long time. Her eyes went wide, and she put her tool down. She picked up the coin and held it close to a candle on her desk. The gold reflected the orange light, and the green stone in the snake's eye seemed to glow. "Where did you find this?" she asked. Her voice was now a quiet whisper. "In a dusty shop near the docks." Silas answered. The old man said, "It is part of a dangerous story. I think you know that story, Elena." Elena stood up and walked to the window. She looked out at the ships in the harbor. "This is not just a story, Silas. This is a key. The snake on this coin is the mark of the serpent's jewel. People say the jewel is as big as a man's hand and more beautiful than the moon. But the island where it stays is hidden by magic and dangerous storms." Silas leaned against the desk. "I want to find that island. I have the coin, but I need someone who can read the old stars and the hidden paths of the sea. I need a partner." Elena turned around. She looked at Silas with a serious expression. She was an adult who had seen many storms and many battles. She knew the risks. Many captains have tried to find the jewel. Their ships are at the bottom of the ocean now. It is a long journey, and we will need a very fast ship. "I can find a ship," Silas said. "And I can find a crew. But I cannot find the island without you." Elena looked at the coin again. She touched the green stone eye of the snake. A small smile appeared on her face. "The sea is calling us, Silas. I will go with you. We will find the jewel together." The next morning, the sun was bright over the harbor of Tortuga. Silas and Elena walked along the wooden docks. The area was full of people working. Men carried heavy bags of grain and large barrels of water. The air smelled of wet wood and old fish. Silas looked at the many ships in the water. Some were very big with many cannons, while others were small and slow. "We need a ship that can move faster than the wind," Elena said. She looked at a large ship with white sails. "That one is too heavy. The Navy will catch us in a day." They walked to the far end of the docks. There, a ship sat alone in the water. It was painted dark gray and black. It was not as large as the Navy ships, but it looked very thin and sharp. The masts were tall and strong. On the back of the ship, the name was written in faded gold letters, "The Sea Shadow." A man stood on the deck of the ship. He was a large man with a red face and very little hair. He was wearing a dirty white shirt and brown trousers. This was Mr. Miller, a man who sold old ships to pirates and traders. He saw Silas and Elena and waved his hand. "She is a beauty, is she not?" Mr. Miller asked with a wide smile. His voice was loud and rough. Silas climbed the wooden ladder to the deck. The wood moved under his boots. He walked to the center of the ship and looked at the masts. He touched the thick ropes. They were dry but still strong. He went below the deck to look at the wood. It was dark and dry. There was no water at the bottom of the ship. This was a good sign. "How much do you want for her?" Silas asked. He came back to the deck and looked at Mr. Miller. "She is the fastest ship in this port." Mr. Miller said, "I want 500 gold pieces. She needs some new paint and some new sails, but she is a queen of the ocean." Silas looked at Elena. She moved around the deck, looking at the steering wheel and the compass. She nodded her head slowly. She liked the ship. "I will give you 400 gold pieces," Silas said. He looked Mr. Miller in the eye. "She needs work. The sails are old, and the wood needs oil." Mr. Miller looked at the ship and then at Silas. He stayed silent for a minute. Then, he put out his hand. 450. "That is my final price, Captain." Silas took the man's hand and shook it. The skin was rough like sand. "It is a deal. I will bring the gold this afternoon." Mr. Miller jumped off the ship onto the dock. The wood moved as he landed. Silas and Elena stood alone on their new ship. Silas looked up at the tall masts. The wind moved through the ropes. "We have a ship, Elena," Silas said. "Now we need a crew." She replied. And we need to be fast. Captain Thorn is always watching the harbor. The sun went down, and the sky became a dark purple color. Silas and Elena went to a tavern called the Rusty Anchor. This place was very loud and full of smoke. It was a place for adults who worked hard on the sea. There were no children here, only men and women with tired eyes and strong arms. Silas stood on a wooden chair in the middle of the room. He wanted everyone to hear him. He raised his hand, and the room became a little quieter. The heavy boots of the sailors made a dull sound on the floor as they turned to look at him. "Listen to me," Silas shouted. "My name is Captain Silas Vane. I have a ship, and I have a mission. I am looking for the best sailors in Tortuga. I need people who are brave. I need people who do not fear the big waves or the dark night." A very tall woman stood up from a table in the corner. She had a long scar on her arm and carried a large knife at her belt. "Where are you going, Captain?" she asked. Her voice was deep and steady. "And why should we follow you?" "We are going to find the Serpent's jewel," Silas answered. A collective gasp went through the room. Some people laughed, but others looked interested. "It is a dangerous journey, but the reward is great gold for everyone." The woman walked toward Silas. Her heavy boots made a rhythmic sound against the wood. "I am Tilda," she said. "I can fix any sail and fight any man. I am tired of this port. I want to see the horizon again." Silas nodded. "Welcome to the crew, Tilda." Next, a man with very large muscles and a friendly face walked forward. "I am Barnaby," he said. "I am the best at moving the heavy cannons. I can also cook a good meal when the sea is calm." Silas smiled. A good cook was very important on a long trip. "You are in, Barnaby." For 2 hours, Silas and Elena talked to many people. They looked at their hands to see if they were strong. They looked into their eyes to see if they were honest. They chose 20 adults. There were 12 men and 8 women. All of them were experienced sailors. They knew how to tie complex knots and how to watch the stars at night. Elena wrote their names on a piece of paper. The pen moved across the page. When she finished, she looked at Silas and nodded. "We have our crew," she whispered. Silas looked at the new sailors. "Meet at the docks when the moon is high," he told them. "We sail tonight. Do not be late." The sailors began to leave the tavern. The heavy door opened and closed many times. Silas felt a mix of excitement and worry. He had a ship and a crew. Now, the real danger was about to begin. The moon was high and bright in the night sky. It cast a silver light over the quiet harbor. Silas stood on the deck of the Sea Shadow. He watched as his new crew arrived one by one. They moved like shadows across the wooden docks. They did not speak. They carried their small bags of clothes and tools. Each adult sailor climbed the ladder and waited for orders. "Is everyone here?" Silas asked Elena. She was standing near the large wooden steering wheel. She looked at her list and nodded. 20 sailors are on the deck, Captain," she said. "The wind is moving toward the east. It is a good time to leave." Silas turned to the crew. "Quietly now," he said. "We do not want the Navy to hear us. Tilda, take 3 sailors to the front. Barnaby, help with the heavy ropes. We must move the ship away from the dock without a sound." The sailors began to work. They were very professional. They pulled the thick, wet ropes with their strong hands. The heavy anchor began to rise from the dark water. It made a slow, grinding sound against the side of the ship. Silas watched the water. Small circles moved across the surface as the ship started to drift. They used long wooden poles to push the ship away from the stone dock. The wood moved against the harbor wall. Slowly, the sea shadow moved into the center of the channel. The city of Tortuga was dark. Only a few yellow lights stayed on in the windows of the taverns. "Raise the sails," Silas ordered in a low voice. Tilda and her team pulled the ropes. The large, dark sails moved up the tall masts. When the wind hit the cloth, it made a sharp sound. The ship suddenly felt alive. It leaned to one side and began to move faster. The water at the front of the ship made a constant, rushing sound as the wood cut through the waves. The crew worked through the night. As the hours passed, the dark blue of the sky began to change. A soft orange light appeared on the horizon. The stars became faint and then disappeared. The sun started to rise, turning the ocean into a field of bright gold. Silas looked back. The city of Tortuga was now very small. The tall buildings looked like tiny toys. The harbor was far behind them. Elena turned the wheel, and the ship moved toward the open sea. The air was fresh and cold. "We are out of the port," Elena said. She looked at the horizon with a smile. "The ocean is ours now." Silas felt the movement of the ship under his boots. He looked at the vast blue water ahead. There were no other ships in sight. They were finally free, but he knew the journey was only beginning. The Serpent's jewel was waiting somewhere across this great ocean. The morning was very calm. The sea shadow moved slowly over the small waves. The sun was hot, and the sailors worked on the deck with quiet energy. Tilda was cleaning a long piece of metal, and Barnaby was checking the barrels of water. Everything seemed peaceful. Silas stood at the front of the ship and looked at the blue water. He felt good about his crew and his ship. However, the peace did not last long. Around noon, Silas noticed a change in the air. The temperature dropped, and the wind began to smell like wet earth and cold metal. He looked toward the north. A thin line of dark gray was growing on the horizon. It looked like a wall of smoke. "Elena, look at the sky," Silas called out. Elena stopped her work and walked to the edge of the ship. She looked at the dark clouds. They were moving very fast. "The weather is changing," she said. Her voice was serious. "That is not a normal rain. It is a big storm, and it is coming straight for us." Silas turned to the crew. "Listen up," he shouted. His voice was strong and clear. "A storm is coming. We must prepare the ship now. Tilda, take 2 sailors and tie down the barrels. Barnaby, check the ropes on the sails. We do not want anything to fall into the ocean." The crew moved quickly. The peaceful mood was gone. The sky turned from blue to a dark, scary gray. The sun disappeared behind the thick clouds. The light on the water became dim and ghostly. The wind began to blow harder. It made a high, whistling sound as it passed through the thin ropes of the masts. The ship started to lean more to the left. The waves were no longer small. They were growing taller and had white tops. Each time a wave hit the side of the ship, it made a heavy, wet thud. "Lower the sails," Silas ordered. "We cannot have the wind pull the masts down." Tilda and Barnaby pulled the heavy ropes. The large black sails came down quickly. The sailors used their strong arms to tie the cloth tightly. They worked together like a single machine. Rain started to fall. At first, it was just a few drops. The drops felt cold against Silas's skin. Then, the rain became a heavy wall of water. It made a constant, loud drumming sound on the wooden deck. It became very hard to see. The horizon disappeared into the gray mist. Silas held onto a thick wooden rail. The ship rose high on a big wave and then dropped down fast. He could hear the wood of the ship making a low, groaning sound under the pressure. "Stay at your posts," Silas yelled over the sound of the wind. "We must ride this out." The sea shadow was now in the middle of the storm. The adventure was no longer a dream. It was a fight for survival. The ocean was no longer blue. It was a dark, angry grey. Huge waves rose up like mountains and then fell back down. The sea shadow felt very small in the middle of the great storm. Every few seconds, the ship rose high into the air. Then, it dropped fast into a deep valley of water. The movement was violent and sudden. Silas held a thick rope with both hands. His clothes were completely wet. The cold rain felt like small stones hitting his face. "Hold on tight," he shouted to the crew. His voice was loud, but the wind was louder. The wind made a high, constant whistling sound as it moved through the masts and the rigging. At the back of the ship, Elena was fighting with the large steering wheel. The water wanted to turn the ship sideways. If the ship turned sideways, a big wave could flip it over. She used all her strength to keep the ship straight. Her face was set in a hard line of focus. Silas saw her and ran to help. Together, the two adults held the wheel. Their muscles were tight and tired, but they did not let go. Suddenly, a loud, sharp sound echoed across the deck. A thick rope had broken near the middle mast. The rope whipped through the air with great speed. It hit a wooden barrel, and the barrel broke into many pieces. Tilda saw the danger. She crawled across the wet, slippery deck. She did not stand up because the ship was moving too much. "Barnaby, help me!" Tilda yelled. Barnaby moved quickly. He used his large arms to grab the loose rope. The rope was heavy and wet. It tried to pull him toward the edge of the ship. Tilda reached him and grabbed the rope too. Then, 3 more sailors joined them. They all pulled together. Their boots slid on the wet wood, but they did not stop. They moved the rope back to the mast and tied it with a very strong knot. The storm continued for hours. Lightning flashed in the dark sky. Each flash of light showed the giant waves for a second. The thunder made a deep, low rumbling sound that shook the wood of the ship. No one went below the deck. Everyone stayed outside to help. They worked as one team. When one sailor was tired, another took their place. Silas looked at his crew. They were exhausted and cold, but they were brave. They were not just sailors now, they were a team. Slowly, the very large waves began to get smaller. The wind was still strong, but it was not as violent as before. The heavy rain changed into a light mist. "The worst is over," Silas called out. He looked at the ship. It was still floating, but he could see that some things were broken. The sea shadow had survived the great storm, but they had a lot of work to do. The next morning, the sun rose over a very quiet ocean. The water was as smooth as a mirror. It was hard to believe that a giant storm happened only a few hours ago. Silas walked onto the deck. He was very tired, and his muscles felt sore. He looked around at his ship. The sea shadow was in bad shape. There were broken ropes everywhere, and one of the small wooden boats was gone. "Captain, come quickly," Tilda called from below the deck. Her voice sounded worried. Silas ran down the wooden stairs. He found Tilda and Barnaby in the storage room at the bottom of the ship. There was water on the floor. It was not deep yet, but it was moving around their boots. Silas looked at the side of the ship. A large piece of wood was broken. A hole about the size of a man's head allowed the ocean water to push inside. The water made a constant, splashing sound as it entered the ship. "We must fix this now," Silas said. "If the hole gets bigger, the ship will sink." Barnaby moved a heavy barrel to see the hole better. "I have extra planks of wood in the back," he said. "But we need to stop the water first." Silas took his coat off and pushed it into the hole. This slowed the water down. "Tilda, go get the thick tar and the heavy hammers. Barnaby, bring the strongest wood you have. We need to work fast." The crew worked together in the dark, wet room. The air was hot and smelled like salt and old wood. Barnaby brought 2 large planks of oak. He held them against the side of the ship with his powerful arms. Tilda arrived with a bucket of black, sticky tar and a bag of metal nails. The sound of metal hitting metal began to fill the room. Each strike was loud and steady. Silas held a lamp so the others could see. Tilda put the thick tar around the edges of the new wood. The tar was very sticky and had a strong, sharp smell. She used a flat tool to spread it evenly. Then, she and Silas took turns using the hammers. They drove the nails deep into the thick wood. After an hour of hard work, the splashing sound stopped. The hole was covered. The new planks were strong and tight against the hull of the ship. "Good work," Silas said. He wiped the sweat from his forehead. "Now we must move the water out of the ship." For the next 3 hours, the crew used buckets to carry the water back to the ocean. Their arms were tired, but no one stopped. They worked in a long line, passing the buckets from one person to the next. By noon, the floor was dry. Silas walked back to the deck and looked at the horizon. The ship was safe for now. He felt a deep pride in his crew. They were strong adults who knew how to handle trouble. "We are ready to move again," Elena said. She was standing at the wheel. "The map says we are close to the first island." Silas nodded. "Then let us find it." The sun was high in the sky, and the air was very warm. The crew of the Sea Shadow was busy cleaning the deck and drying their wet clothes. After the long night and the repairs, everyone was tired. However, they were still alert. They knew that they were in unknown waters. Silas stood at the front of the ship with his telescope. He looked at the horizon for a long time. Suddenly, he saw a thin line of green against the blue of the ocean. He adjusted the glass of the telescope. The green line became larger and clearer. It was an island. "Land!" Silas called out. His voice was full of energy. "I see an island to the west." The sailors ran to the side of the ship. They looked in the direction Silas pointed. Elena joined him and looked through her own glass. "That must be the island of the Blue Lagoon," she said. "The map says we need to find fresh water and fruit there. It is a good place to rest before the final part of our journey." Silas turned the ship toward the green land. As they moved closer, the island became very beautiful. There were tall palm trees with large, green leaves. The beach was made of very white, fine sand. The water near the shore was a light turquoise color and very clear. You could see the rocks and small fish under the surface. "Lower the anchor," Silas ordered. Barnaby and 2 other sailors moved the heavy metal anchor. They pushed it over the side. It fell into the ocean and created a large circle of white foam as it hit the water. The ship stopped moving. The water was very calm here. There were no big waves, only the soft movement of the sea against the wood. "We will take the small boat to the shore," Silas said to the crew. "Elena, Tilda, and Barnaby will come with me. The rest of you stay here and watch the horizon. We do not know if Captain Thorn is nearby." They lowered the small wooden boat into the water. Silas, Elena, Tilda, and Barnaby climbed down the rope ladder. They used wooden oars to move the boat toward the beach. The oars moved through the water with a rhythmic, wet sound. When the boat hit the sand, Silas was the first to jump out. His boots sank into the soft, warm white sand. It felt strange to stand on solid ground after so many days on the moving ship. The island was very quiet. There was only the sound of the wind in the trees and the distant calls of colorful birds. "It looks empty," Tilda whispered. She held her knife tightly in her hand. "It looks peaceful," Elena said. She looked at the thick jungle behind the beach. Silas looked at the ground. He wanted to find a path into the trees. But as he looked at the sand, he stopped. He saw something that made him very worried. Silas looked at the beach. The sand was very white, but it was not smooth. He saw a line of marks that went from the water to the trees. He knelt down and touched one of the marks. It was a footprint. The footprint was much larger than his own boot. It was deep, which meant the person was heavy or carrying something heavy. "Look at this," Silas said to Elena. Elena walked over and looked at the sand. Her face became very serious. "These are fresh," she said. "The water has not touched them yet. Someone was here this morning." Tilda held her knife tightly. She looked at the thick green jungle behind them. The trees were very tall, and their leaves were large and dark. "Maybe it is a sailor who survived a wreck?" she asked. "No," Silas replied. He pointed to another mark. "Look at the shape of the heel. These are professional boots. These belong to a sailor or a soldier. A common survivor does not have boots like these." They followed the footprints toward the edge of the forest. The air under the trees was much cooler than on the beach. It smelled like wet leaves and old earth. They found a small area where the grass was flat. In the middle, there was a circle of black stones and grey ash. It was a fire pit. Silas reached out and touched the ash with his finger. "It is cold," he said. "But the wood is not rotten. This fire was burning yesterday." Barnaby walked a few steps into the bushes. He found a piece of blue cloth hanging on a sharp branch. He picked it up and showed it to Silas. The cloth was thick and strong. It was the color of a stormy sky. "This is from a uniform," Elena whispered. "Captain Thorne's sailors wear this color. I saw it once in a port in the north." Silas felt a heavy feeling in his stomach. He knew Captain Thorne was a dangerous man. Thorne did not care about rules. He only cared about gold and power. If Thorne was on this island, the journey was going to be much harder. Silas knew they had to be very careful. Suddenly, the birds in the trees stopped singing. The jungle became very quiet. The only sound was the soft movement of the ocean behind them and the slow breathing of the crew. Silas looked into the dark shadows of the trees. He felt like many eyes were looking back at him from the darkness. "We should not stay here in the open," Silas said in a quiet voice. "We need to find out where they went. If Thorne is here, he is looking for the path to the temple, just like us." Tilda nodded. She looked at the footprints again. They led deeper into the forest, toward a large hill in the center of the island. "The prints go that way," she said, pointing to a dark opening in the trees. Silas took a deep breath. He held the handle of his sword. "Then that is where we go. Stay close and move quietly. Do not let the leaves make a sound." They left the bright beach and entered the dark jungle. The adventure was changing. They were no longer just looking for a jewel. They were now in a race against a dangerous enemy. The jungle was thick and difficult to walk through. Silas used his heavy sword to cut the large green leaves and vines. The air was very wet and warm. It was hard to breathe. Silas, Elena, Tilda, and Barnaby moved slowly. They did not want to make any noise. Every time a foot hit a dry branch, it made a sharp sound that seemed very loud in the quiet forest. They followed the deep footprints for a long time. The ground started to go up. The soft dirt changed into hard, grey rock. The trees were not as thick here, but the shadows were still dark. High above, the sun was bright, but very little light reached the ground. "The footprints are harder to see on the rock," Elena whispered. She leaned down and looked at the ground. She saw a small scratch on a stone. "But look here. Someone moved this stone recently." They turned a corner around a giant tree with red flowers. Behind the tree, there was a high wall of black rock. In the middle of the wall, there was a large, dark hole. It was the entrance to a cave. The opening was tall enough for two men to walk through at the same time. As they stood near the entrance, a strange sound came from inside. It was a low, soft sound. It was not a voice, but it sounded like many people were talking in very quiet voices far away. The wind moved in and out of the cave, passing through small holes in the rock. This created a rhythmic, hushed sound. The Cave of Whispers. Elena said softly, "I heard stories about this place. The sailors say the island speaks to those who enter." "It is just the wind, Elena," Silas said, though he felt a little cold. He took a small torch from his bag. He used a piece of metal and a stone to create a spark. A small flame appeared, and the torch began to burn. The orange light moved across the dark walls of the cave. The walls were wet. Water ran down the stone in thin lines, making a constant, light dripping sound on the floor. Silas held the torch high. He saw the footprints again. They were visible in the soft, wet sand on the cave floor. They went deep into the darkness. "They are inside," Tilda said. She looked at her knife and then at the dark hole. "Thorn's men are not afraid of stories." "Neither are we," Silas replied. "But we must be careful. Caves are good places for traps." They stepped into the cave. The air inside was much colder than the jungle air. The light from the torch showed strange shapes on the ceiling. There were long, sharp rocks hanging down like teeth. Silas walked first, holding the light. Elena followed him, looking at the walls for any signs or maps. The whispering sound of the wind became louder as they walked deeper. It felt like the cave was watching them. Silas kept his eyes on the floor, following the path of the mysterious sailors who arrived before them. The cave was much larger than it looked from the outside. The ceiling was high, and the air was very still. Silas held the torch forward. The light hit something that was not rock. In a small corner of the cave, there was a bed made of dry grass and a small wooden stool. A very small fire was burning in the center of the room. The wood made a soft, rhythmic popping sound as it burned. Sitting by the fire was a man. He was very old. His skin was the color of dark wood from many years in the sun. He had a very long white beard that reached his chest. His clothes were made of old, dirty pieces of cloth and large green leaves tied together with vines. He was an adult, but he looked like he was part of the island itself. The old man did not move. He looked at the fire with wide, blue eyes. When Silas stepped onto a small stone, it made a sharp clicking sound. The old man jumped up quickly. He held a sharpened stick in his hand. "Wait. We are not your enemies," Silas said. He lowered his torch to show he was not going to fight. "I am Captain Silas Vane. We are sailors." The old man looked at Silas, then at Elena, Tilda, and Barnaby. He saw their clean boots and their steel swords. He slowly lowered his stick. A long breath came out of his mouth. "Sailors," he whispered. His voice was rough and dry, like he had not used it in a long time. "It has been many years since I saw a friendly face." "Who are you?" Elena asked. She stepped forward with a kind expression. "How long have you been in this cave?" "My name is Arthur," the man said. He sat back down on his stool. He looked very tired. "I was the navigator on a ship called the Golden Gull. We came here looking for the jewel 20 years ago. A giant storm destroyed our ship. I am the only one left." Silas sat on the ground across from Arthur. 20 years is a long time to be alone, Arthur. We found footprints on the beach. There are other men on this island now. Arthur's face became very pale. He grabbed Silas's arm with a trembling hand. "Yes. I saw them. They are not like you. They have black hearts and heavy guns. Their leader is a man with a cold face. They call him Captain Thorn. We know him, Tilda said. Her voice was hard. He is looking for the temple. Arthur nodded slowly. The light from the fire moved across the deep lines on his face. The temple is a dangerous place. It does not want to be found. But Thorn's men are moving fast. They have maps and they have many tools. They passed this cave only a few hours ago. Silas looked at his friends. They had to move. Arthur, can you help us? Do you know the secret path to the temple? The old sailor looked into the dark depths of the cave. There is a path, but it is full of shadows. If you go, you might never come back. Arthur leaned closer to the fire. The orange light made his long beard look like white smoke. He looked at Silas with very serious eyes. Captain Thorn is not like other pirates, Arthur said. His voice was low and shaky. He is a man of ice. I saw him from the bushes when he arrived. He does not smile. He does not rest. He treats his sailors like tools, not like people. If one falls, he leaves them behind. Silas nodded. He knew the reputation of the man. We are not here to fight him, Arthur. We are here for the jewel. We want to find it and leave. Arthur shook his head slowly. The jewel is the heart of the island, but the temple protects its heart. You must listen to my warning. I have lived here for 20 years, and I have seen the temple doors. Many have tried to open them. No one comes back the same. What do you mean? Elena asked. She sat next to Silas. She was listening carefully. The temple has a breath. Arthur whispered. When the sun hits the top of the building, the air inside becomes dangerous. It is a sweet smell, like flowers, but it makes the mind go to sleep. You must cover your faces with wet cloth when you enter the main room. Barnaby looked at his large hands. We have cloth. We can do that. And there is more. Arthur continued. He picked up a small, flat stone from the cave floor. He used a piece of black coal to draw a symbol on the stone. It was a picture of a sun with many lines. Thorn has the coins, just like you. But he does not have the knowledge. He thinks the coins are just keys. They are more. They are a balance. If you put them in the wrong way, the temple will fall. Silas took the stone from Arthur. It felt cold and smooth. Why are you telling us this, Arthur? You do not know us. The old man looked at the fire again. A small, sad smile appeared on his face. I am old, and I will die on this island. But I do not want a man like Thorn to have the jewel. He will use it for war and pain. You have kind eyes, Captain Vane. You have a crew that cares for each other. That is a strength Thorn does not have. Silas stood up. He felt the weight of the golden coin in his bag and the weight of Arthur's warning in his mind. Thank you, Arthur. We will remember your words. Go now. Arthur said. The sun is moving. Thorn is already at the base of the great hill. You must be fast, but you must be careful. The crew left the warm fire and the old man. They walked back into the dark parts of the cave. They found a small exit on the other side of the rock. The whispering wind felt more like a warning now. Silas looked at the great hill in the distance. He knew the race was on. Silas, Elena, Tilda, and Barnaby stepped out of the narrow exit of the cave. The bright sun made them squint. They were now high on the side of the great hill. The view was beautiful, but Silas did not look at the trees or the colorful birds. He looked straight at the blue water of the bay. In the distance, a new ship was moving toward the beach. It was much larger than the sea shadow. Its sails were a dark, dirty gray, and the wood of the ship was painted the color of old blood. This was the Iron Talon. It was the ship of Captain Thorn. It moved through the water with power and speed. The ship had 3 tall masts and many cannons on each side. It was built for war, and it looked very dangerous. A loud, metallic sound echoed across the water. It was the sound of a heavy brass ship's bell. The sound was sharp and repeated many times. It was a signal to everyone on the island that the predator had arrived. Silas saw small wooden boats being lowered from the side of the Iron Talon. Each boat was full of adult men wearing blue coats. They were carrying long guns and heavy bags. Silas saw a man standing on the back deck of the large ship. The man was wearing a long black coat and a hat with no feathers. Even from far away, Silas knew it was Captain Thorn. The captain stood very still, watching the island like a hawk watching a mouse. "They are landing," Elena whispered. She held her hand over her eyes to see better. "They are not going to wait for the morning. Thorn wants to reach the temple before the sun goes down." Silas felt his heart beating fast. "We cannot let them get there first. We know the path from the cave, but they have more men. We must move now." The crew began to move down the steep side of the hill. The ground was covered in loose stones and dry leaves. Every step was difficult. Barnaby almost fell on the slippery rocks, but Tilda caught his arm with her strong hand. They did not speak because they needed to save their breath for the long run. The sound of the bell continued to ring across the island. It was a constant reminder of the danger behind them. The air was hot, and the jungle was thick. Silas led the way, using his hands to push aside the heavy branches. He could see the dust rising from the beach as Thorn's sailors jumped onto the sand. "We need to reach the ancient bridge," Silas said to the others. "If we get there first, we can control the path to the temple." They pushed through the bushes. The plants had sharp thorns that pulled at their clothes. Silas ignored the scratches on his arms. He only thought about the golden coin in his bag. The race to the shore was over. Now, the race to the heart of the island had truly begun. Silas and his team reached the edge of the jungle. The bright light of the beach was ahead of them. Silas held up his hand to stop the group. They stayed behind a large, fallen tree and looked out at the sand. Captain Thorn was standing near a small boat. He was exactly as Arthur described him. He was a tall man with a very thin, pale face. His black coat was long and clean, despite the heat. He stood with his back to the ocean, looking at the great hill. His sailors were busy moving boxes and guns from the boats to the shore. The sailors moved quickly and did not talk. The only sound was the rhythmic washing of the waves against the sand and the distant cries of sea birds. Silas stepped out from the trees. He did not want to hide. He wanted Thorn to know he was here. Elena, Tilda, and Barnaby followed him onto the open sand. Their boots made a soft, crunching sound on the dry shells. One of Thorn's sailors saw them and raised his long gun. Thorn held up a gloved hand. The sailor lowered the gun immediately. Thorn turned around slowly. His eyes were the color of a winter sky, cold and gray. He did not look surprised. He looked at Silas as if he were looking at a small insect. "Captain Vane," Thorn said. His voice was quiet, but it was very clear. It was a cold voice that made the air feel heavy. "I heard you were looking for a treasure. You are a long way from Tortuga." Silas stopped 10 feet away from Thorn. He kept his hand near the handle of his sword, but he did not pull it out. "The ocean is free for everyone. Thorn, this island is not yours." Thorn took a step forward. He was taller than Silas. "This island belongs to the man who can take it. I have the men, I have the guns, and I have the map. You have a small ship and a few friends. You should turn around and sail away." "I have the coin," Silas said. He saw Thorn's eyes move slightly. The mention of the coin changed the energy of the conversation. Thorn's face became even harder. "The coin is a tool. Give it to me, and I will let you leave this beach alive." If you refuse, my men will bury you in this sand before the sun sets. You want the jewel?" Silas replied, his voice steady. "But the temple is not an easy place. You need more than just a map. You need to know the secrets of the island." Thorn let out a short, dry sound that was almost a laugh. "I do not believe in secrets or stories. I believe in power. I will find the temple, and I will take what is inside." The two captains looked at each other for a long time. The tension was very high. Tilda and Barnaby were ready to fight, and Thorn's sailors were watching their leader for a signal. But Thorn did not give the signal. He looked at the sun, which was beginning to move lower in the sky. "The race is not over yet, Vane," Thorn said. He turned his back to Silas and started to walk toward the jungle path. "But do not get in my way again. The next time we meet, I will not use words." Thorn and his men disappeared into the green shadows of the trees. Silas stood on the beach, watching them go. He knew the talk was finished. The next confrontation would be a battle. Silas looked at the dark path where Thorn and his men disappeared. He knew they could not stay on the beach. He turned to Elena, Tilda, and Barnaby. "We must go back to the ship now," he said. His voice was urgent. They ran across the white sand. The sun was very hot on their backs, and the air was thick. They reached the small wooden boat. Together, the four adults pushed the boat into the blue water. The water made a loud, wet sound as the boat moved off the sand. They jumped inside and grabbed the wooden oars. Silas and Barnaby pulled the oars with all their strength. The oars moved through the water with a rhythmic, heavy sound. They looked back at the beach one last time. They did not see Thorn's men anymore. The green jungle had swallowed them. The sea shadow was waiting for them in the calm water of the lagoon. The sailors on the deck looked worried. They were looking at the Iron Talon in the distance. The large ship was like a dark cloud on the horizon. It had many cannons and 3 tall masts. It was much bigger than Silas's ship. Silas reached the side of the sea shadow. He climbed the rope ladder quickly. Elena and the others followed him. When Silas reached the deck, his first officer, a man named Marcus, ran to him. Marcus was an older sailor with many grey hairs and a steady hand. "Captain, that ship is moving," Marcus said. He pointed to the Iron Talon. "They are moving toward the opening of the lagoon. If they reach the gap between the rocks, we will be trapped here. We will have nowhere to go." Silas looked at the big ship. Marcus was right. Thorn wanted to block the only way out. If the sea shadow stayed in the lagoon, Thorn could use his many cannons to destroy them. "Raise the anchor," Silas shouted. His voice echoed across the deck. "Barnaby, go to the lower deck. We need every person ready. Tilda, get the sailors to the masts. We need the sails up now." The deck became very busy. The sailors ran to their positions. They pulled the thick, heavy ropes. The metal anchor began to rise from the bottom of the sea. It made a slow, grinding sound of metal against the wood of the ship. The large black sails moved up the tall masts. When the wind hit the cloth, the sails made a sharp, snapping sound. The sea shadow began to move. It felt light and fast in the water. Silas stood at the back of the ship near Elena. She held the steering wheel with both hands. Her eyes were fixed on the narrow exit of the lagoon. "Can we make it?" Silas asked. "It will be close," Elena replied. She did not look away from the water. "The wind is helping us, but the Iron Talon has very large sails. It is a very fast ship for its size." The ship moved toward the open ocean. The water at the front of the ship made a constant, rushing sound as the wood cut through the waves. Silas looked at the Iron Talon. It was getting closer and closer. He could see the sailors on Thorn's ship moving. They were preparing the cannons for a fight. The sea shadow reached the narrow opening of the lagoon. The rocks on both sides were very high and sharp. The ship moved through the gap with only a few feet to spare. Just as they reached the open sea, the Iron Talon turned to follow. They were out of the lagoon. They were safe for a moment. Silas breathed a sigh of relief. He looked at the horizon. He knew Thorn would follow them across the whole ocean. The hunt was not over. The sea shadow moved through the dark blue water of the open ocean. The island was now a small, dark shape behind them. The sun was setting, and the sky was full of soft colors like orange and purple. Silas and Elena were inside the captain's cabin. The room was small and full of the smell of old paper and salt. A single candle sat on the wooden table. Its light made long shadows on the walls. Silas took the golden coin from his leather bag. He put it on the table. The gold was very bright under the candle's flame. The green stone in the snake's eye seemed to watch them. Elena opened a small wooden box on her desk. She took out a special tool. It was a lens made of very clear glass with a silver handle. "My father gave me this lens," Elena said quietly. "He told me that some secrets are too small for the eyes. We must look closer." She held the lens over the coin. She moved her head down and looked through the glass. Her eyes moved slowly across the surface of the gold. Silas stood very still. He did not want to disturb her. He heard the constant, soft sound of the waves against the side of the ship. "Silas, come and see this," Elena said. Her voice was full of surprise. Silas leaned over the table. He looked through the lens. The picture of the snake was now very large. He could see every scale on the snake's body. He realized that the scales were not just patterns. They were tiny, thin lines. "These are not scales," Silas whispered. "These are drawings of trees and rocks." "Exactly," Elena replied. "Look at the middle of the snake. There is a drawing of a mountain. And here, near the tail, there is a series of tiny dots. They form a line." Elena took a piece of clean paper and a black pen. She looked through the lens and began to draw what she saw. The pen moved across the paper. She drew a map of the island. It was much better than any map they had before. "Thorn is looking at the great hill," Elena explained. She pointed to a spot on her drawing. "He thinks the temple is at the top. But look at these dots on the coin. The path goes around the hill. It leads to a hidden valley that is not visible from the beach." Silas felt a cold excitement. So Thorn is wasting his time. He is climbing the mountain while the jewel is in the valley. "Yes," Elena said with a small smile. "And there is a small river on the north side of the island. My lens shows a way to enter the valley from the water. Thorn's ship is too big for that river, but the sea shadow can do it." Silas looked at the map and then at the golden coin. This was the advantage they needed. They were not as strong as Thorn, but they were smarter. "We must turn the ship," Silas said. "We will sail through the night and reach the north side by morning." He felt the weight of the secret in his heart. The adventure was no longer a mystery. Now, they had a clear path to the Serpent's jewel. The sea shadow moved quietly through the dark night. The moon was hidden behind thick, black clouds, so there was very little light on the water. Silas stood at the front of the ship. He looked at the ocean, but he could not see very far. The air was becoming cold and very wet. Slowly, a thick, white fog began to roll across the waves. At first, it was thin like smoke. Then, it became as thick as a heavy blanket. Within minutes, the ship was surrounded by a wall of white. Silas could no longer see the tall masts or the sailors at the back of the ship. Everything was hidden in the mist. "Elena, can you see the stars?" Silas called out. He had to raise his voice, but the fog seemed to make his words sound soft and flat. "No, Silas," Elena replied from the steering wheel. Her voice sounded far away in the white air. "The sky is gone. I cannot see the stars, and I cannot see the horizon. We are sailing blind." The ship moved slowly. Silas felt a sense of danger. In this part of the ocean, there were many hidden rocks and small islands. If the ship hit a rock, the wood would break, and they would sink in minutes. The only sound was the constant, soft rhythmic movement of the water against the side of the ship and the low, steady creaking of the wooden boards. Tilda and Barnaby were on the deck. They held lanterns, but the yellow light did not help. It only made the fog look like a glowing wall. The sailors stood very still. They were listening for the sound of waves hitting rocks. Their faces were serious and wet from the damp air. "We should stop," Barnaby whispered to Tilda. "We are going to hit something. We cannot stop." Tilda replied. "Thorn is behind us. If we stop, he will find us when the sun rises." Silas walked back to Elena. He used his hands to find his way along the wooden rail. When he reached her, he saw she was holding the map she drew from the coin. She was also holding a small compass. The coin said the path is straight to the north. Elena said. She looked worried but determined. "I am following the needle of the compass. But the currents are strong here. The water is trying to push us to the east." "Trust the map, Elena," Silas said. He put his hand on her shoulder. "The old man and the coin brought us this far. We must keep moving." The night felt very long. The fog did not go away. It felt like the ship was floating in a world made of white clouds. Silas stayed awake, watching the mist. He felt the cold water on his skin and heard the silence of the ocean. Suddenly, the silence changed. Silas leaned forward. He heard a new sound. It was a heavy, wet movement in the water, like something very large was swimming near the ship. It was not the sound of waves. It was the sound of a giant breathing. The fog was a heavy wall around the sea shadow. The sailors stood in their places, but they did not work. They were listening. Silas stood near the front of the ship. He did not move. He kept his eyes on the white mist. The ocean was very calm, but the ship felt different. It was moving in a strange way, as if the water itself was nervous. Then, the sound came again. It was a long, low sound of air moving. It was like a very large chest rising and falling. It was not the wind. The wind was quiet. This was the sound of a living creature taking a deep breath. "Do you hear that?" Barnaby whispered. His face was pale in the yellow light of his lantern. He held the wooden rail with both hands. His muscles were tight, and his knuckles were white. "I hear it," Tilda replied. She did not look at him. She looked at the water. She held the handle of her knife, but she did not pull it out. "Something is following us. Something very big." A large wave hit the side of the ship. It was not a normal wave. It came from the side where the wind was not blowing. The ship leaned to the left. The wooden boards of the ship made a deep, groaning sound as they moved against each other. Some of the sailors almost fell. They grabbed the thick ropes to stay safe. Silas walked to the edge of the ship. He looked down into the dark water. The fog made it hard to see, but he saw a change in the ocean. There was a large, dark shadow moving just under the surface. It was longer than the ship itself. It moved with a slow, rhythmic power. The water pushed against the wood of the sea shadow as the creature passed by. "Elena, keep the ship straight," Silas called out. He tried to keep his voice calm and steady, but his heart was beating very fast in his chest. "I am trying, Silas," Elena shouted back. Her hands were firm on the steering wheel. "The water is moving in circles. The ship is very hard to control. It feels like something is pulling us. The sound of the breathing became louder. It was very close now. Then, there was a heavy, wet sound as a giant piece of skin rose out of the water. It was dark green and covered in small, hard bumps. It stayed above the water for a few seconds and then went back down with a powerful movement. The water made a loud, rushing sound as it closed over the creature. The sailors were silent. They were adults who had seen many things on the sea, but they were afraid now. They knew the legends of the sea serpent, but they never thought the stories were true. They looked at the mist, waiting for the creature to appear again. "Is it the serpent?" Marcus asked. He was an experienced sailor, but his voice was shaking. "It is something very old," Silas said. He looked at the spot where the creature disappeared. "It is the guardian of the jewel. We are in its home now." The fog started to move faster. The wind was coming back. But the sound in the mist did not stop. The creature was still there, waiting in the dark, cold water. Silas knew that the next few minutes would decide if they lived or died. The wind became a strong force, and the thick fog started to move away. It did not disappear completely, but it opened like a curtain. The moon appeared behind a cloud, and its silver light hit the water. Silas stood at the front of the ship, his hands holding the wooden rail so tightly that his fingers were white. The water in front of the sea shadow began to boil. It was not hot, but it moved in a wild, fast circle. A giant wave rose up, and the ship leaned back. Then, the creature finally appeared. First, a long, thick neck rose out of the ocean. It was covered in dark, heavy scales that looked like wet stone. The neck went higher and higher until it was taller than the main mast of the ship. Then, the head appeared. It was as large as a small boat. The creature had two giant eyes that glowed with a bright, yellow light. It did not have hair. It had sharp, bony fins on its head that looked like a crown. The sea serpent stayed very still. It looked down at the ship with its glowing eyes. It did not attack immediately. It seemed to be watching the crew. The air smelled of salt and something very old, like deep mud from the bottom of the sea. "Nobody move," Silas shouted. His voice was steady, but he felt a cold fear in his stomach. "Do not pull your swords. Do not fire the cannons. We must stay quiet." The sailors were like statues. Tilda held her breath, and Barnaby stayed very close to a heavy wooden barrel. They were adults who had fought many battles, but they knew they could not fight a monster of this size. The ship felt like a tiny toy next to the serpent. The creature moved its head closer to the ship. It was so close that Silas could see the water dripping from its scales. The sound of its breathing was like the sound of a large bellows. The serpent looked at Silas, and then it looked at the leather bag on his belt. It seemed to know that the golden coin was inside. A strange green light began to glow from the serpent's chest. The light was exactly the same color as the eye of the snake on Silas's coin. The green light moved up the creature's neck and reached its eyes. For a moment, the whole ocean around the ship turned a bright, ghostly green. "It knows why we are here," Elena whispered from the steering wheel. Her voice was full of wonder and fear. "It is the guardian. It is checking our hearts." The serpent let out a long, low sound of air. It was not a scream, but a deep vibration that shook the wood of the ship. Then, as quickly as it arrived, the creature began to sink. It moved backward into the dark water. The giant neck disappeared, and then the head went under the surface. A massive wave hit the ship as the serpent moved away into the deep. The ocean became calm again. The fog was gone, and the stars were bright in the sky. Silas took a deep breath. His heart was still beating very fast. He looked at the horizon and saw the shape of the island in the distance. "We are alive," Barnaby said, his voice shaking. "Yes," Silas replied. "But now we know what is waiting for us." The jewel has a protector, and it is more powerful than any ship. The water near the back of the sea shadow exploded upward. The sea serpent was back, and it was no longer peaceful. It let out a deep, vibrating roar that shook the entire ship. The creature looked angry. Its yellow eyes were wide, and it moved its long neck through the air like a whip. "It is attacking!" Silas shouted. "To your stations! Barnaby, get the cannons ready." The sailors moved with incredible speed. They were adults who knew that their lives depended on their actions in the next few seconds. Barnaby and 4 other strong sailors ran to the side of the ship. They pulled the heavy iron cannons toward the open ports. The metal wheels made a grinding sound against the wooden floor. "Load the cannons," Barnaby ordered. His voice was loud and firm. The sailors pushed heavy black powder and large metal balls into the cannons. They used long wooden tools to pack everything tightly. The Serpent rose high above the ship and brought its head down with great force. It hit the main mast, making the whole ship lean dangerously to one side. The wood made a loud, cracking sound, but the mast did not break. "Fire!" Silas yelled. Barnaby touched a small flame to the back of the first cannon. A huge cloud of grey smoke filled the deck. There was a very loud sound. A heavy metal ball flew through the air and hit the Serpent's neck. The creature made a high, pained sound. More smoke filled the air, and the smell of gunpowder was very strong. "Again! Do not stop!" Silas commanded. The other cannons fired one by one. Each shot made the ship jump in the water. The metal balls hit the water around the Serpent, creating giant splashes. One ball hit the creature's shoulder, and dark green blood began to flow into the ocean. The Serpent was surprised by the power of the ship. It moved its head back and forth, trying to find a way to stop the noise and the pain. The creature opened its mouth wide. Silas could see rows of sharp, white teeth. It tried to grab a sailor from the deck, but Tilda was ready. She threw a heavy spear with all her strength. The spear hit the Serpent near its eye. The beast pulled back, shaking its head violently. The battle continued for several minutes. The air was thick with smoke, making it hard to see. The sound of the cannons was constant and very heavy. Silas watched the Serpent carefully. He saw that the beast was becoming tired. The metal balls were too much for it to handle. Finally, the Serpent let out a final, low groan. It turned away from the ship and began to swim into the deep water. It moved quickly, leaving a trail of green blood behind it. The giant waves it created slowly became smaller. The deck was quiet now, except for the heavy breathing of the crew. They were covered in grey dust and sweat. They looked at the empty ocean. "We did it," Barnaby said, wiping his face. "We drove it away." Silas looked at the damage to the mast. "We survived," he said. "But the ship is hurt. We need to find the canal before it returns." Silas looked at the sky. The moon was still bright, but the air felt heavy. The main mast of the Sea Shadow was in trouble. The giant sea serpent had hit the wood with its powerful head. Now, there was a long, deep crack in the center of the mast. The sails were still catching the wind, but Silas knew they could not move fast for very long. "Captain! The water is moving again behind us," Tilda shouted. She was looking at the dark trail of green blood the serpent had left behind. The bubbles in the water showed that the creature was not far away. It was below the surface, waiting for the right moment to strike again. Elena turned the heavy wooden wheel. "We need a place to hide, Silas. The ship is too slow to win a race now. We are an easy target in the open water." Silas pulled the map from his bag. He held a small lantern close to the paper. The light moved as the ship rocked on the waves. He looked at the tiny dots Elena had copied from the golden coin. "The canal is near," he said. It is a hidden path between the high rocks. If we can reach it, the serpent cannot follow us. Its body is too large for the narrow space." He looked at the horizon. In the silver moonlight, he saw two massive walls of black stone. They stood like giants in the ocean. Between the two walls, there was a very thin line of dark water. It looked like a narrow door into the island. "There. Head for the gap," Silas ordered. His voice was firm. The crew moved into action. They were tired from the battle, but they knew they had no choice. Tilda and Barnaby ran to the front of the ship. They prepared long wooden poles to push the ship away from the rocks if they got too close. The sea shadow moved toward the dark opening. The sound of the ocean hitting the rocks was very loud and constant. It was a rhythmic, heavy thumping that shook the air. "Steady," Elena whispered to herself. She held the wheel with all her strength. The ship felt the pull of a strong current. The water was trying to push the wood against the sharp stone. The ship entered the gap. The high walls of rock rose up on both sides, blocking the moon. It became very dark and cold. The space was so narrow that the ends of the wooden beams almost touched the stone. The crew stayed very quiet. They could hear the water rushing through the canal and the sound of their own breathing. Suddenly, a giant wave hit the back of the ship. Silas looked back and saw a massive head rise out of the water for a second. The serpent tried to enter the canal, but its wide shoulders hit the rocks. The stone did not move. The creature let out a long, angry sound of air and stopped. It could not follow them into the tight space. The sea shadow moved slowly into the quiet, dark water of the canal. They were safe from the beast. Silas looked at his crew. They were all breathing hard, but they were safe. The sea shadow floated slowly through the narrow canal. The high stone walls on both sides blocked the wind, and the water became as flat as a table. The silence was very heavy after the loud sounds of the battle. The only noise was the light movement of the water against the side of the ship and the slow, rhythmic creaking of the wooden masts. "Drop the small anchor," Silas said quietly. "We will stay here for a few hours. The crew needs to eat and sleep." The sailors did not move quickly. They were exhausted. Their clothes were torn and covered in grey gunpowder dust. Some had small cuts on their arms from the flying wood. Barnaby went down to the kitchen area. A few minutes later, the smell of hot soup and dry bread moved across the deck. It was a simple meal, but it made the sailors feel a little better. Silas sat on a wooden crate near the center of the ship. He looked at his hands. They were shaking slightly. He was an adult who had lived through many dangers, but the sea serpent was unlike anything he had ever seen. He looked at the main mast. The long crack in the wood was deep. It looked like a scar on the ship's body. Tilda walked over to him. She carried 2 metal plates with food. She gave one to Silas and sat down on the floor. The metal plates made a light sound as they touched. "The crew is talking, Captain," Tilda said. Her voice was low so the others could not hear. "They are afraid. They are experienced sailors, but they did not sign up to fight monsters. Some of them think the island is cursed. They want to turn back." Silas took a bite of the bread. It was hard, but it tasted good. He looked at the sailors sitting in groups on the deck. Their faces were dark in the shadows of the high rocks. They were not looking at the map or the horizon. They were looking at the water with fear. "We cannot turn back now, Tilda," Silas replied. "The serpent is waiting in the open water. If we leave the canal, it will attack us again. Our only path is forward, through the island." Elena joined them. She looked very tired, but her eyes were still sharp. "I checked the map from the coin again. The canal leads to a small lake inside the hidden valley. From there, we can walk to the temple. It is a shorter trip than the path Thorn is taking." "But will the crew follow me?" Silas asked. They are good people, Silas. Elena said. But they need to know that you have a plan. They need to hear your voice. Silas stood up. He walked to the middle of the deck. The sailors stopped talking and looked at him. Listen to me, Silas said. His voice was strong and calm. The Serpent is a guardian, but we are already past it. The hardest part is behind us. We are the only ones who know the true path. I will not lead you into a trap. We will find the jewel, and we will all be rich adults when we return to Tortuga. Trust the ship, and trust me. The sailors were silent for a moment. Then, Marcus nodded his head. We are with you, Captain, he said. One by one, the other sailors agreed. The fear was still there, but the hope was stronger. The moment of calm was over, and the crew began to prepare for the final journey. The sun rose slowly, and its light began to touch the top of the high stone walls. Inside the narrow canal, the air was still cool and grey. Silas woke up and walked to the deck. He felt the cold morning air on his face. The sailors were already awake. They were moving quietly, tidying the ropes and checking the supplies. Silas found Elena at the back of the ship. She was holding the small brass compass in her hands. She looked very worried. Her eyes were fixed on the small tool, and she was shaking her head slowly. What is the matter, Elena? Silas asked. He stood next to her and looked down at the compass. Look at the needle, Silas, she said. Her voice was a quiet whisper. Silas looked at the compass. Usually, the thin metal needle pointed straight to the north. But now, it was moving in fast, wild circles. It did not stop. It hit the sides of the glass. It was as if the needle was trying to find a direction that did not exist. Is it broken? Silas asked. He touched the metal case. It felt strangely warm. No, it is not broken. Elena replied. I tried 3 other compasses from the storage room. They are all doing the same thing. The magnetic field here is crazy. I think the sea serpent's presence or the mountain itself is affecting the metal. Silas looked at the narrow water ahead. Without a compass, they were lost. The canal had many small turns. If they took the wrong turn, they could get stuck in a dead end or hit the rocks in the dark parts of the canal. Marcus walked toward them. He saw the spinning needle and his face became pale. Captain, the sailors are seeing this too. They say the island is pulling the ship. They think we are going into a trap. Silas knew he had to act fast. He could feel the fear growing on the deck. He took the golden coin from his pocket and held it up. The morning sun hit the gold, making it shine brightly. Listen to me, Silas called out to the crew. The sailors stopped their work and turned to look at him. The compass is not working. The island is strong, and it is trying to confuse us. But we have something better than a needle of iron. He pointed to the coin. We have the map of the snake. Elena and I have studied every scale and every line. We do not need a compass to tell us where the north is. We will look at the shape of the rocks. We will look at the way the moss grows on the stones. We will use our eyes and our minds. Elena nodded and pulled out the map she had drawn. The coin shows 3 large rocks that look like fingers. If we find those, we know we are on the right path to the hidden valley. The sailors looked at each other. They were still nervous, but Silas's voice was calm and full of confidence. They returned to their work, but they kept their eyes on the high stone walls, looking for the signs from the coin. The sea shadow began to move again. The water was dark, and the spinning compass sat on the table, a silent reminder that the rules of the ocean did not apply here. They were moving into a place where magic and nature were the same thing. The sea shadow moved out of the narrow canal as the sun began to set. The high stone walls opened up, and the ship entered a large, quiet lake. The water here was very dark and deep. There were many small paths leading away from the lake. Silas looked at the different openings in the rock. Without the compass, they did not know which one to choose. Every opening looked the same in the dim light. The sky turned a deep blue, and then it became black. Thousands of stars appeared. They were very bright because there were no city lights nearby. The air was cool and smelled like fresh water. Silas walked to the back of the ship where Elena was standing. She was not looking at the water. She was looking at the sky with great focus. The compass is still spinning, Elena said. She pointed to the brass tool on the table. The needle was moving fast and made a light, scratching sound as it hit the glass. But the stars never lie. They are the oldest maps in the world. Sailors used them long before the first compass was made. They are steady and true. She moved her hand to point at a group of bright stars. They looked like a giant bird with wide wings. That is the great albatross, Elena explained. In the old stories, the bird always flies toward the hidden heart of the sea. If we follow the star at the tip of the left wing, we will find the valley. The ancient people of this island put that bird in the sky to show the way to the temple. Silas looked at the stars. He felt very small under the giant sky. Are you sure, Elena? The rocks look very similar in the dark, and a mistake could be dangerous. I am sure, Silas, she replied. She reached into her pocket and touched the golden coin. The coin has a small drawing of a bird near the mountain. It matches this constellation exactly. It is not a coincidence. The person who made the coin wanted us to look up at the heavens. Silas called out to the sailors. Tilda, Barnaby, look at the sky. We are following the great albatross tonight. Turn the ship toward the western opening. The sailors looked up. They saw the bright stars and felt a new sense of peace. The fear from the broken compass began to fade. They moved the large wooden steering wheel, and the ship turned slowly. The water made a constant, soft sound as the ship moved forward. The wood of the ship made a low, rhythmic sound that was very familiar and comforting to the crew. As they entered the western opening, the light of the stars reflected off the water. It looked like the ship was sailing on a path made of silver. The crew worked in silence. They were tired, but they were happy to have a direction again. They trusted Elena's knowledge of the heavens. We are close now, Silas whispered to Elena. He could see the dark shape of a forest ahead. I can feel the air changing. It smells like flowers and wet earth. The stars are leading us to our prize, she said. They sailed through the night, guided by the light from above. The mystery of the island was still great, but they were no longer lost in the dark. The sea shadow glided through the final opening in the rocks. As they passed the last of the high stone walls, the view opened up into a place that seemed to belong to another world. This was the Hidden Valley. It was a giant bowl of land protected by high mountains on all sides, keeping it a secret from the rest of the world for centuries. The air here was different. It was warm and heavy with the scent of jasmine and ancient earth. But the most incredible thing was the light. Even though the sun was down and the moon was partially hidden, the valley was not dark. The water in the river was glowing with a soft, blue light. Thousands of tiny organisms in the water created a bioluminescent trail as the ship moved forward, making the sea shadow look like it was sailing on a cloud of neon. On the banks of the river, the trees were covered in flowers that glowed with a faint violet and green light. It was as if the stars had fallen from the sky and settled on the leaves. The sailors stood at the rails, their mouths open in wonder. I have never seen anything like this, Barnaby whispered. He reached out his hand as if he could touch the glowing air. Is this magic, Captain? It is the life of the island, Silas replied. He felt a deep sense of awe. The Serpent's jewel is more than just a gem. Its power is in the soil, the water, and the trees. Elena pointed toward the center of the valley. There. Look through the mist. In the distance, rising above the canopy of the glowing trees, was a massive structure made of white stone. It was the Great Temple. It looked like a small mountain carved by human hands. Even from far away, Silas could see the massive pillars and the wide stairs that led to a dark entrance. The stone was partially covered by thick green vines, but its majesty was clear. It stood as a silent guardian of the island's greatest secret. Anchor the ship here, Silas ordered. The water is becoming shallow. We will take the small boats, and the rest of the way we walk. The crew worked with a new energy. They were no longer afraid. They were inspired. The beauty of the valley had chased away the shadows of the sea serpent. They lowered the small boats into the glowing blue water. Silas, Elena, Tilda, and Barnaby climbed down, making sure they had everything they needed for the final trek. They brought the golden coin and Elena's hand-drawn map. Extra torches and flint for light in the deep temple. Wet cloths, following Arthur's advice to protect them from the sweet air. And their weapons, kept sharp in case Captain Thorn appeared. As they rowed toward the muddy bank, the sounds of the jungle surrounded them. There were rhythmic clicks of insects and the melodic calls of nocturnal birds. The ground was soft and covered in thick moss that felt like a carpet under their boots. We are the first people to stand here in 20 years. Elena said as they stepped onto the land. And we are not alone. Silas added, looking at the distant temple. Thorn is on the other side of that hill. We must reach the doors before he finds another way in. They began their trek through the glowing forest, following the path of the river toward the white stone of the temple. The final stage of their journey had finally begun. The trek through the glowing jungle was shorter than Silas expected, but every step was heavy. The air in the hidden valley was thick, and the silence was deep. As they reached the base of the great temple, the white stone towers seemed to touch the stars. The temple was built into the side of a massive cliff, its architecture a mix of sharp angles and flowing curves that looked like frozen water. There are the stairs, Tilda said, pointing to a wide set of steps that disappeared into the darkness above. Each step was carved with images of sea creatures and celestial maps. They began the climb. Their boots made a hollow, rhythmic clicking sound on the ancient stone. As they rose higher, the view of the valley opened up behind them. The glowing blue river looked like a thread of light woven through a dark green tapestry. Silas stopped for a moment to catch his breath. He looked toward the mountains on the far side of the valley. "Do you see that?" he asked, his voice low. On the distant ridge, tiny yellow lights were moving. They were not the bioluminescent glow of the jungle. They were the orange flickers of oil torches. Captain Thorn and his men had finally found a way over the hill. They were still far away, but they were moving with purpose. "We don't have much time," Elena urged. "They will see the glow of the valley and follow our trail." They reached the top of the stairs. Before them stood a massive set of double doors made of a dark, heavy metal that did not rust. In the center of the doors, at the height of a man's chest, was a circular indentation. It was surrounded by a ring of 12 smaller holes, each carved with a different phase of the moon. "The lock," Silas whispered. He took the golden coin from his bag. The gold seemed to hum with a faint vibration as it got closer to the metal. "Wait," Elena said, grabbing his arm. "Look at the symbols. Arthur warned us. If you put them in the wrong way, the temple will fall." Silas looked closer at the ring of moons. He realized that the symbols were not just decorations. They were a sequence. He remembered the drawings on the coin scales, the tiny dots he thought were just a map. The dots on the coin tail. Silas said, realization hitting him. They weren't just a path. There were 12 of them. Some were filled in, and some were empty. He laid the coin in his palm and used a small torch to see the tiny details. The first dot was a new moon. The seventh was a full moon. The last was a waning crescent. I have to press the symbols in that exact order, Silas said. He reached out and touched the first cold metal moon. It made a soft, mechanical click and stayed depressed. One by one, Silas followed the sequence from the coin. With every press, a deep, low thrumming sound vibrated through the floor. It felt like a giant heart was starting to beat beneath the stone. When he reached the 12th symbol, the circular indentation in the center began to glow with a soft, green light. Now, Silas said. He pressed the golden coin into the center. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then, a sound like grinding thunder echoed through the mountains. The massive metal doors did not swing open. They began to slide into the walls, revealing a long, dark hallway that smelled of salt, ancient dust, and the sweet, dangerous scent of jasmine Arthur had warned them about. Masks on, Silas ordered, pulling a wet cloth over his nose and mouth. They stepped into the temple, the darkness swallowing them as the doors began to slide shut behind them, sealing them away from the world, and from Captain Thorn. The air inside the temple was thick and heavy. Even through the wet cloth masks, Silas could smell the overwhelming scent of jasmine. It was a beautiful smell, but it felt heavy in his lungs, like a thick syrup. He kept his eyes focused on the floor, watching for traps. The walls of the hallway were not made of plain stone. They were covered in a mosaic of crushed pearls and emeralds that shimmered in the light of their torches. "Don't take the masks off," Silas warned, his voice muffled by the fabric. Arthur was right. I already feel a little light-headed. They reached the end of the long hallway and entered a massive circular room. The ceiling was a dome made of dark glass, and the starlight from outside filtered through, casting a dim, blue glow over everything. In the center of the room was a deep pit, and across that pit was the only exit, a door shaped like the mouth of a giant fish. There was no bridge. "How are we supposed to get across?" Barnaby asked, looking down into the darkness of the pit. He dropped a small stone, and they waited. It took several seconds before they heard a faint clink far below. Elena held her torch over the edge. "Look at the walls of the pit. There are metal rings and levers. This isn't just a hole, it's a machine." Tilda stepped forward, her eyes scanning the carvings on the floor near the edge. There were 4 stone pads, each marked with a symbol: a wave, a flame, a cloud, and a stone. "It's a weight puzzle," Tilda said. She had spent years working on complex ship engines. She understood how gears and balances worked. If we stand on these pads in the right order, the bridge might come out. But it needs all of us. Silas looked at the symbols. He remembered the back of the golden coin. Around the edge of the snake, there had been 4 small icons. The first was a cloud. The second was a flame. The third was a stone. The fourth was a wave. Tilda, take the cloud. Barnaby, the flame. Elena, the stone. "I'll take the wave," Silas ordered. They moved to their positions. "On the count of 3, Silas said. 1, 2, 3. They stepped onto the stone pads at the same time. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, a deep grinding sound started beneath their feet. From the walls of the pit, thick wooden beams began to slide out. They moved with a rhythmic, mechanical precision, locking into each other to form a narrow, sturdy bridge across the gap. "It's working," Barnaby shouted. But as they started to move toward the bridge, a loud boom echoed from the entrance of the temple. The heavy metal doors they had just closed were being hit from the outside. Thorn had reached the top of the stairs, and he wasn't waiting for a key. He was using gunpowder to blow the doors open. "Move!" Silas yelled. "Cross the bridge. Now!" They ran across the wooden beams. The bridge felt solid, but the sound of the explosions behind them made the whole temple shake. Just as Silas, the last one across, stepped onto the solid floor of the fish-mouth door, the bridge began to retract back into the walls. The puzzle was resetting. "We have a head start," Elena said, her breath coming in quick gasps. "But Thorn won't be far behind. He'll figure out the pads or just jump the gap if he has to." They turned toward the dark path ahead. The sweet air was getting stronger, and Silas knew they were getting closer to the heart of the temple. The fish-mouth door led into a small, winding staircase made of a dark green stone that felt like glass. The walls were cold, and the sound of the explosions behind them became a muffled, rhythmic thumping. Silas led the way, his torch flickering as the air grew thinner. Finally, the stairs ended, and they stepped into the largest chamber Silas had ever seen. It was a vast, natural cavern that had been shaped into a cathedral of stone. High above, the ceiling was lost in shadows, but the room was filled with a pulsing, emerald light. In the center of the chamber, surrounded by a pool of perfectly still water, sat a tall pedestal made of white marble. Resting on top of that pedestal was the object of their long journey, the Serpent's jewel. It was the size of a man's fist, cut into a perfect teardrop shape. It didn't just reflect light, it seemed to generate it. The green glow moved inside the stone like a liquid, swirling in a slow, hypnotic rhythm. "It's beautiful," Elena whispered, her mask falling slightly as she gasped. "It looks alive." "Don't touch the water," Silas warned, noticing the strange, metallic sheen on the surface of the pool. "Arthur said the temple protects its heart. This is the final layer." They walked around the edge of the pool. The path was narrow and wet. As they approached the pedestal, Silas noticed 4 small statues of hooded figures surrounding the water. Each figure held a stone bowl in its hands. "Look," Silas pointed. "The bowls are empty, but there are pipes connected to the walls." Suddenly, the heavy thumping at the entrance stopped. A moment of chilling silence followed, broken only by the sound of heavy boots echoing from the staircase they had just climbed. Captain Thorn stepped into the chamber. His black coat was covered in dust, and he held a heavy pistol in one hand. Behind him, 10 of his strongest sailors emerged from the shadows, their eyes wide with greed as they saw the jewel. "Captain Vane," Thorn said, his voice cold and echoing, "you have done a magnificent job finding the path. But your part in this story is over." "The jewel isn't yours, Thorn," Silas said, stepping between the pirate and the pedestal. "You don't understand the balance here. You'll destroy the island." Thorn let out a short, dry laugh. "I don't care about the island. I care about the power that stone represents. Step aside, or my men will paint these white walls red." The tension in the room was like a stretched wire. Silas looked at the statues, then at the jewel, and then at Thorn. He realized that the jewel wasn't just sitting there. It was held in place by a thin beam of light coming from the ceiling. "The statues, Elena!" Silas shouted, realizing the final puzzle. "They need light. Use the mirrors on the walls." Before Thorn could react, Silas dived toward a large, polished silver disc mounted on the wall. He kicked it, tilting the angle. A beam of starlight from the ceiling hit the silver, bounced off, and struck the bowl of the first statue. The statue began to glow. "Stop them!" Thorn screamed, raising his pistol. The chamber erupted into chaos. Thorn's men charged forward, swords drawn, while Silas and his crew fought to activate the final defense of the temple. The sound of Thorn's pistol echoed through the chamber like a clap of thunder. The lead ball whistled past Silas's ear, shattering a small piece of the white marble pedestal behind him. Silas didn't flinch. He scrambled toward the second silver disc, his boots sliding on the smooth, wet stone. "Barnaby! Tilda! Keep them back!" Silas roared over the din of the fighting. Barnaby let out a guttural shout, swinging a heavy wooden beam he had snatched from the floor. He met the first wave of Thorn's sailors with the strength of a mountain. Tilda moved like a shadow, her twin knives flashing in the emerald light as she parried strikes and pushed the attackers away from the central pool. Elena reached the third mirror. She grabbed the cold metal frame and heaved. The gears beneath the floor groaned, protesting centuries of stillness. "It's stuck, Silas!" she cried, ducking as a pirate's cutlass swung over her head. Silas sprinted across the narrow walkway, leaping over a fallen sailor. He reached Elena and put his shoulder against the mirror's edge. Together, they pushed with everything they had. With a loud, metallic snap, the mirror pivoted. The beam of starlight hit the silver surface and leaped across the room, striking the second statue's bowl. The chamber began to hum. It was a low-frequency vibration that Silas could feel in his teeth. 2 of the 4 statues were now glowing with a brilliant, white intensity. "You're too slow, Vane," Thorn shouted. He had discarded his pistol and drawn a long, thin rapier. He moved with a cold, calculated grace, stepping over the chaos of the melee. He wasn't interested in the fight. He was interested in the duel. He began to edge around the pool, heading straight for the pedestal. "Stop him!" Elena screamed. She grabbed a heavy stone bowl from the floor and hurled it at Thorn, but he swerved effortlessly, his eyes never leaving the serpent's jewel. Silas looked at the final 2 mirrors. They were located on the far side of the chamber, blocked by 3 of Thorn's largest men. He drew his own sword, the steel singing as it left the scabbard. "I'll handle the mirrors. Elena, find a way to distract Thorn." Silas charged. He wasn't just a captain now. He was a man fighting for the future of his crew and the safety of the world. He parried a heavy blow from a pirate's axe, using the momentum to spin and kick the second man in the chest. He reached the 3rd mirror and struck it with the pommel of his sword, knocking it into the correct alignment. 3 statues were now lit. The emerald glow of the jewel began to pulse faster, turning from a soft green to a blinding, electric white. The water in the pool started to swirl, forming a miniature whirlpool that hissed as it moved. Thorn reached the pedestal. He ignored the vibrating floor and the screaming wind that was beginning to whip through the cavern. He reached out a gloved hand, his fingers inches away from the teardrop stone. "It's mine," Thorn whispered, a look of pure, cold madness in his eyes. "No!" Silas yelled, throwing himself toward the final mirror. As he slammed the silver disc into place, the 4th beam of light struck the final statue. The 4 statues didn't just glow. They emitted a solid wall of white light that converged on the pedestal. A massive shockwave erupted from the center of the room. The force of it threw everyone, Silas, Thorn, and the sailors, backward. The emerald light of the jewel expanded, filling the entire cavern until everything was swallowed by a brilliant, silent white. For a moment, there was no sound, no pain, and no gravity. There was only the heart of the island, beating one last time. The blinding white light faded slowly, leaving blue spots in Silas's vision. He lay on the cold stone floor, his ears ringing and his muscles aching. The heavy, sweet scent of jasmine was gone, replaced by the sharp, clean smell of ozone and wet earth. Silence filled the chamber, a heavy blanket that made the world feel empty. Silas pushed himself up on his elbows. Across the room, he saw Elena and Tilda helping Barnaby to his feet. They looked battered and covered in white dust, but they were alive. He then turned his gaze toward the center of the room. The pedestal was empty. The serpent's jewel no longer sat on its marble perch. Instead, the white stone of the pedestal had cracked down the middle. In the air above it, a small, swirling vortex of green mist remained, spinning slowly like a dying star. Then he saw Thorn. The pirate captain was on his knees near the pool. His black coat was torn, and his hat was gone. But it was his face that made Silas freeze. Thorn was staring at his own hands with an expression of pure horror. His fingers were turning into a dull, grey stone. The transformation was moving slowly up his arms, turning skin and cloth into cold, hard rock. What is this?" Thorn's voice was no longer cold and powerful. It was a thin, terrified rasp. "The balance, Thorn," Silas said, his voice raspy. He stood up, leaning against a pillar for support. "Arthur warned us. The jewel isn't just a treasure. It's the anchor for the island. By trying to take it by force, you broke the circuit." Thorn looked at the empty pedestal, then back at Silas. "I had it. I touched it." "And the island touched you back," Silas replied. The temple began to groan. It wasn't the rhythmic mechanical sound from before. It was the sound of a mountain breaking. Large cracks appeared in the glass dome above, and pieces of white stone began to fall like heavy rain. The emerald light that had filled the cavern was fading, replaced by the grey shadows of a collapsing tomb. "We have to go. Now!" Elena shouted, grabbing Silas's arm. "The jewel! We can't leave without it!" Barnaby yelled, looking at the swirling green mist. "It's gone, Barnaby," Silas said, pulling his friend toward the staircase. "The jewel returned to the earth. There's nothing left here but dust and stone." They didn't look back. They ran for the narrow staircase, the sound of the temple's destruction following them like a predator. Behind them, a final, high-pitched scream from Thorn was cut short by the sound of falling rock. The man of ice had finally become a man of stone, a permanent part of the temple he tried to rob. As they scrambled down the winding stairs, the ground beneath them buckled. The hidden valley was changing. The glowing blue river was turning dark, and the bioluminescent trees were flickering out one by one. The magic of the island was retreating, hiding itself deep beneath the soil to protect what remained. They reached the great metal doors just as the entrance began to cave in. They dived through the gap and tumbled onto the white stone stairs outside. They didn't stop until they reached the bottom, their hearts hammering against their ribs. Silas stood on the mossy ground and looked up. The great temple was silent. The white stone looked dull in the early morning light. The race was over. They had no gold, no gems, and no jewel. "We lost it," Tilda said, her shoulders slumped. "All that for nothing." Silas reached into his pocket and felt the golden coin. It was cold and plain now. The green eye of the snake turned to simple glass. He looked at his crew, exhausted, hurt, but alive. "Not for nothing," Silas said quietly. "We have the ship. We have the crew. And we have a story that no one in Tortuga will ever believe." The sun rose fully over the island of the Blue Lagoon, but it was no longer the magical, glowing place they had entered. The vibrant purples and neon blues had faded into the standard greens and browns of a tropical jungle. The sweet air of the temple had been replaced by the salty, sharp breeze of the morning sea. Silas and his crew made their way back to the riverbank. They walked in silence, the weight of their exhaustion finally catching up to them. When they reached the small boats, Silas looked back one last time at the great hill. The temple was no longer visible. It seemed to have melted back into the white stone of the cliffside, hiding its secrets for another generation. As they rowed back to the sea shadow, they passed the Iron Talon. The massive, blood-red ship sat silent in the water, its anchor still down. Without Captain Thorn to lead them, the remaining pirates had fled into the woods or surrendered to the overwhelming silence of the island. "What will happen to them?" Barnaby asked, nodding toward the abandoned ship. "The ocean will take the ship eventually," Silas said. "And the men, well, the island has a way of dealing with those who don't belong." They climbed back onto the deck of the Sea Shadow. The crew gathered around them, their faces a mix of hope and disappointment when they saw Silas's empty hands. Silas stood by the mast, the one with the deep, jagged crack that served as a reminder of their battle with the Serpent. "We don't have the Serpent's jewel," Silas announced, his voice carrying across the deck. "The stone returned to the island. It was never meant to be carried in a velvet bag or sold in a market. It belongs to the earth." A low murmur went through the sailors, but Silas held up a hand. "However," he continued, a small, weary smile tugging at his lips, "we found something else. We found that this ship can survive a storm that would sink a navy. We found that we can outrun the fastest predator in the sea. And we found that even when the stars go dark and the compass spins, we have each other to find the way home." He reached into his pocket and pulled out the golden coin. It was no longer a key, but it was still gold. He tossed it to Marcus, his first officer. "Sell it when we get to Tortuga," Silas said. "Divide the gold equally among the crew. It's not a king's ransom, but it's enough for a long rest and a tall drink. As for the rest of us—" He looked at Elena, who was already at the wheel, her eyes fixed on the open sea. He looked at Tilda and Barnaby, who were already checking the ropes. "We have a ship to repair," Silas said, "and a world that still has a few secrets left to find." The anchor rose with a familiar, rhythmic grinding sound. The sails, patched and worn, caught the morning wind with a proud snap. The sea shadow turned away from the hidden valley, moving through the narrow canal one last time. As they hit the open ocean, the water was clear and blue, with no sign of the giant beast that had guarded the gate. Silas stood at the rail, watching the island shrink into a tiny green on the horizon. He knew that people would tell stories of the captain who went looking for the Serpent's jewel and came back with nothing but his life. But Silas knew better. "A treasure is only as good as the hands that hold it," he whispered to the wind. "And my hands have never felt more full." The sea shadow leaned into the waves, cutting through the salt spray as it headed north. The adventure of the Serpent's jewel was over, but for Silas Vane and his crew, the horizon was just beginning. The sea shadow limped into the harbor of Tortuga under a bruised evening sky. Her main mast was bound with thick iron bands and heavy hemp rope, a jagged scar that whispered of the sea serpent's fury. The black sails were peppered with holes from Thorn's grapeshot, looking more like a ghost ship than the pride of the fleet. As the anchor dropped with a familiar, heavy splash, Silas stood on the quarterdeck, feeling the strange stillness of the land. The docks were as loud and chaotic as ever. The air was thick with the smell of roasting meat, cheap rum, and the salty tang of the low tide. Men and women of all nations moved through the torchlight, their voices a constant roar of laughter and argument. Silas watched as Marcus coordinated the gangplank. The crew, once exhausted and fearful, now walked with their heads held high. They were the ones who had seen the Serpent and lived. "Marcus, take the coin to old man Barnaby's shop," Silas ordered, handing over the golden disc. It was just a piece of metal now, but in Tortuga, gold was the only language everyone understood. "Get the best price. I want the ship repaired by dawn, and I want the crew's pockets heavy before they hit the taverns." As the crew dispersed, Silas stayed behind with Elena. They walked to the local shipwright, a massive man named Hob who had arms as thick as tree trunks. Hob looked at the sea shadow and whistled low through his teeth. "You've been through a hurricane, Captain. Or did you try to sail through a mountain?" "A bit of both, Hob," Silas replied, leaning against a stack of fresh timber. "Can you fix the mast?" "It needs to be stronger than before. We aren't done with the deep water yet." Hob spat on the ground and nodded. "It'll cost you. Oak ain't cheap this time of year, and iron is scarce. But for the man who stood up to Thorn, I'll have her ready in 3 days." That night, Silas sat in a dark corner of the Rusty Anchor, the town's most infamous tavern. He watched his crew celebrate, but his mind was elsewhere. He kept thinking about the way the light had moved inside the Serpent's jewel. It hadn't felt like a stone, it had felt like a pulse. As he sipped his drink, a shadow fell over his table. It was a woman dressed in fine silk, out of place in the dirty tavern. She wore a silver mask that covered the upper half of her face. "Captain Vane," she said, her voice like velvet. "They say you found the temple, but came back with empty hands. Some call it a failure. I call it an opportunity." Silas looked up, his eyes narrowing. "I'm not looking for work, You don't know what I'm offering," she whispered, sliding a small, wax-sealed tube onto the table. "Thorn wasn't just looking for a jewel. He was looking for the map it protects. And I think you still have the key." Silas stared at the wax-sealed tube. The seal was stamped with a symbol he didn't recognize, a weeping eye inside a crescent moon. He looked back at the woman in the silver mask, but she was already moving toward the door, her silk skirts rustling against the rough floorboards. She disappeared into the crowd before he could ask a single question. He picked up the tube. It was cold to the touch and felt heavier than it looked. He didn't open it in the tavern. Tortuga had too many eyes and even more knives. He finished his drink and walked back to the ship, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. The docks were quieter now, the moonlight reflecting off the dark, oily water. Back in his cabin, Silas lit a single candle. The flame danced in the draught, casting long, jumping shadows across the wood. He broke the seal and pulled out a single piece of parchment. It wasn't paper, but vellum, dried animal skin, thin and translucent. It was blank. A trick. Silas muttered to himself. He held it up to the candle, expecting hidden ink to appear under the heat. Nothing. He turned it over. Still nothing. He was about to throw it aside when he remembered Elena's lens. He pulled the glass from his desk and looked through it. Under the magnification, he saw thousands of tiny, microscopic pinpricks in the vellum. They weren't ink marks, they were holes. He realized what it was, a star chart. But it wasn't a map of the sky they knew. It was a projection. If he held the vellum up to a specific light source, the shadows would form a path. He experimented with the candle, moving the parchment back and forth. Finally, the light passed through the pinpricks and hit the wooden wall of his cabin. The shadows formed the shape of a constellation, the Great Albatross, but with one significant difference. There was a star at the bird's heart that didn't exist in the sky. Beneath the projection, a single word was written in the shadow. Oakhaven. Oakhaven. Silas whispered. He had heard the name in old sailors' songs. It was a legendary city that had supposedly sunk into the sea 1,000 years ago, located in the frozen waters of the far north. People said it was where the ancient kings hid the Crown of Neptune, a relic that could control the tides themselves. A soft knock at the door made him jump. It was Elena. She looked tired, her hair messy from the wind. "The repairs are started," she said. "But Silas, something is wrong. I went back to the Iron Talons wreckage on the beach before we left the island. I found a logbook Thorn had hidden in a floorboard." She placed a scorched leather book on the desk. He wasn't working alone, Silas. He was being paid by someone in the Navy. Someone high up. They weren't after the jewel for the gold. They wanted the jewel to find the path to Oakhaven. Silas looked at the shadow map on his wall. The mystery was growing deeper, and the stakes were no longer just about survival. They were in the middle of a war for the ocean itself. 3 days passed in a blur of hammers, saws, and the smell of hot tar. Hob was true to his word. The sea shadow was reborn. The new mast was a pillar of blackened oak, reinforced with steel bands that gleamed in the sun. The hull had been scraped and painted, and the black sails were replaced with heavy, reinforced canvas. She looked faster and more dangerous than the day she was built. Silas stood on the pier, watching Barnaby load crates of salted beef and fresh water. The atmosphere in Tortuga had changed. People were whispering as he passed. The story of the sea serpent had spread like wildfire, and every sailor in the port wanted to join his crew. But Silas was picky. He didn't want gold-hungry pirates. He needed people who could handle the cold. "We're headed north, Marcus," Silas said as his first officer approached. "The far reaches. Beyond the ice wall." Marcus's eyes widened. "That's a graveyard, Captain. The ice will crush a wooden hull like a walnut." "Not this hull," Silas replied, patting the side of the ship. "And we have no choice. If the Navy is looking for Oakhaven, they'll send the North Star Fleet. We need to get there first." As they prepared to cast off, a small boat approached from the direction of the governor's mansion. A man in a crisp blue uniform stood at the front. He wasn't a pirate. He was an officer of the Royal Navy. The docks went silent. Pirates reached for their pistols, but Silas held up a hand. The officer climbed the ladder and stepped onto the deck. He looked around with a sneer of disgust. "Captain Silas Vane." "That's me," Silas said, standing tall. "You're a long way from the Citadel, Lieutenant." "I have a message from Admiral Vane," the officer said, pulling a scroll from his belt. Silas felt a cold shock go through him. The name hit him like a physical blow. Admiral Vane. "Your uncle sends his regards," the officer said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "He knows what you found on the island. He knows about the map. He wants you to know that the HMS Sovereign is already 5 days ahead of you. He suggests you stay in Tortuga and spend your gold. The North belongs to the Crown." The officer turned and left, leaving the scroll at Silas's feet. Silas didn't pick it up. He looked at Elena, who was standing by the wheel. The memory of his family, the family that had disowned him and turned him into a pirate, rushed back. His uncle, Julian Vane, was the most feared admiral in the world. He was a man who believed in order, discipline, and the absolute power of the Navy. "He thinks I'm a child playing with toys," Silas said, his voice low and dangerous. "He thinks he can take the North because he has more cannons." He looked at his crew. They were looking back at him, waiting for his command. The fear was gone, replaced by a fierce loyalty. Barnaby, Tilda, Marcus. "Cast off." Silas roared. "We aren't going to Oakhaven for the gold anymore. We're going to show the Admiral that the Sea Shadow doesn't follow his laws." The transition from the warm, tropical waters of the Caribbean to the North Atlantic was brutal. The air turned from a humid embrace to a sharp, biting wind that felt like needles against the skin. The crew of the Sea Shadow swapped their linen shirts for thick wool and heavy furs. The deck was constantly slick with salt spray that froze into dangerous patches of ice. Silas stood at the bow, his face wrapped in a heavy scarf. The ocean was no longer blue. It was a dark, steel grey, and the waves were massive, rolling hills of water that threatened to swallow the ship. In the distance, the first icebergs began to appear, giant, silent cathedrals of white and blue that drifted aimlessly in the current. "The shadow map is holding true," Elena said, emerging from the cabin. She was bundled in a thick bearskin coat, her nose red from the cold. She held the vellum up to the pale morning sun. "The heart of the albatross is directly ahead. But the ice is getting thicker. Silas. We're going to have to navigate the flows." "Where is the Sovereign?" Silas asked. "Marcus spotted smoke on the horizon yesterday," she replied. "The Admiral is using steam power. He doesn't need the wind. But he's heavy. He has to stay in the deeper channels. We can go where he can't." Tilda walked toward them, her hands covered in grease. She had been working on a new invention in the hold, a series of reinforced iron plates that could be lowered over the bow to act as an icebreaker. "The plates are ready, Captain. If we hit a small floe, we'll cut right through. But if we hit a growler, the wood will still splinter." Suddenly, a cry came from the crow's nest. "Ship ahead." "To the starboard." Silas grabbed his telescope. Emerging from behind a massive iceberg was a ship, but it wasn't the Sovereign. It was a small, fast schooner, its sails tattered and white with frost. It was flying a black flag, but it was hanging limp and frozen. "It's a ghost ship," Barnaby whispered, crossing himself. "No," Silas said, watching the deck of the other ship through the glass. "It's not a ghost. It's trapped." The schooner was wedged between two massive sheets of ice. The pressure of the floes was slowly crushing the hull. Silas could see men on the deck, waving their arms frantically. They were freezing and desperate. "We have to help them," Elena said. "If we stop, we lose time," Silas countered. "The Admiral is gaining on us." "Silas, look at the flag again," Tilda said, taking the glass. "That's the Ice Runner. That's Kalen's ship. He's the best ice pilot in the world. If he's trapped, it means the path ahead is even worse than we thought. But if we save him, he can guide us through the labyrinth." Silas looked at the trapped ship and then at the dark, frozen horizon. He knew that in the north, a good pilot was worth more than 100 cannons. "Turn her in," Silas ordered. "Prepare the harpoons and the heavy ropes. We're going to pull them out." The sea shadow moved cautiously toward the trapped schooner. The ice groaned all around them, a deep, haunting sound like a giant beast waking up. Silas could feel the vibration of the floes through the soles of his boots. The iron plates Tilda had installed at the bow shrieked as they ground against the frozen edges of the path. "Easy, Elena. Keep her in the center," Silas shouted. The ice runner was in a bad state. The ice had pushed up against her port side, lifting the ship partially out of the water. The wood was screaming under the pressure, and one of the masts had already snapped, hanging like a broken limb. "Barnaby, get the line ready," Silas commanded. Barnaby stood at the edge of the deck, holding a massive harpoon tied to a thick, greased rope. With a grunt of effort, he launched the harpoon. It flew through the freezing air and thudded deep into the ice runner's sturdy wooden railing. The sailors on the other ship scrambled to secure it. "Full reverse," Silas yelled to the crew at the sails. The sea shadow strained against the ice. The ropes went taut, humming with tension. For a long minute, nothing happened. The ice seemed to hold onto its prize with a stubborn grip. Then, with a sound like a cannon firing, the ice sheet cracked. The ice runner slid back into the water with a massive splash, sending a wave of slush and freezing foam over the sea shadow's deck. A man jumped from the schooner's rail onto Silas's ship. He was tall, thin, and had eyes the color of the ice itself. He was covered in frost, but he was smiling. "Captain Vane, I assume," the man said, rubbing his frozen hands together. "You picked a hell of a day for a stroll in the park." "Kalen," Silas said, nodding. "I heard you were the king of the ice. You don't look like a king right now." "Even kings get stuck in the mud sometimes," Kalen laughed, though his breath was a thick cloud. "But you're the one heading for Oakhaven. I can see it in your eyes. And I can see that shadow map in your navigator's hand." "We need a pilot," Silas said, getting straight to the point. "The Admiral is behind us, and the ice is closing in." Kalen looked at the sea shadow, his eyes moving over the repairs and the iron-plated bow. "She's a sturdy girl. With my eyes and your luck, we might just make it. But you should know, Captain, Oakhaven isn't just a city. It's a gate. And the things that live in the deep ice don't like visitors." "We've already fought a sea serpent, Kalen," Silas replied. "We aren't afraid of the dark." "The serpent was a pet compared to what's ahead," Kalen said, his voice suddenly serious. "But let's get moving. The Sovereign has icebreakers made of steel. They won't stop for anyone." As the sea shadow turned back toward the north, Kalen took a position next to Elena at the wheel. The journey was no longer a race against the weather. It was a race against a man who shared Silas's name but none of his mercy. The sea shadow entered the region known as the Glass Graveyard, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, leaving the world in a perpetual, haunting twilight. The ice here was different from the white floes they had passed earlier. It was clear as crystal and sharp as a jagged blade. Massive spires of ice rose from the dark water, reflecting the stars in a million directions. It was beautiful, but it was a death trap. "Kalen, we're losing the channel," Elena shouted, her breath a thick plume of white. The steering wheel was vibrating under her hands as the current fought against the ship. Kalen stood at the very tip of the bow, leaning out over the iron plates. He didn't use a telescope, he used his ears. He listened to the way the water hissed against the ice. "Hard to port, Elena. There's a shelf just under the surface. If we touch it, The hull will peel like an orange. The ship groaned as she turned. The sound of ice scraping against the iron-plated bow was a constant, nerve-wracking shriek. Silas stood near the main mast, his eyes scanning the horizon for the smoke of the Sovereign. He knew his uncle was close. Admiral Julian Vane was a man of logic and iron, but even he would find this labyrinth a challenge. "Tilda, how are the plates holding?" Silas called out. Tilda emerged from the hatch, her face smudged with grease and soot. "The rivets are screaming, Silas. The cold is making the metal brittle. If we hit anything larger than a growler, the plates might snap off and take the bow with them. Keep them together, Tilda." "We don't have a choice," Silas replied. Barnaby and the rest of the crew were stationed along the rails with long wooden poles tipped with iron. They pushed away the smaller chunks of ice that threatened to jam the rudder. It was exhausting work. Their muscles were stiff from the cold, and their hands were numb despite the heavy furs. Every few minutes, a growler, a piece of ice mostly submerged and nearly invisible, would thud against the ship, sending a shudder through the wood. "Silas, look at the shadow map," Elena called from the quarterdeck. Silas ran to her side. The vellum map was glowing in the dim light. The heart of the albatross was pulsing with a soft, rhythmic light that seemed to match the vibration of the ship. "The frequency is increasing," Silas noted. "We're getting closer to the source." Suddenly, Kalen raised a hand. "Stop. Drop the anchor. Now." The crew scrambled to obey. The anchor fell, biting into the icy mud below. The sea shadow came to a shivering halt. Ahead of them, the ice was no longer a labyrinth, it was a solid wall of white. It stretched as far as the eye could see, rising hundreds of feet into the air. "The ice wall," Kalen whispered, his voice full of awe. "They say it marks the end of the world. But look there, at the base." Silas adjusted his glass. At the bottom of the massive wall, hidden by the shadows of the spires, was a narrow, glowing crack. It wasn't a natural cave, the edges were too straight, too perfect. It was a doorway. "That's the path to Oakhaven," Silas said. "But we aren't the only ones who found it." Behind them, a massive beam of light cut through the twilight. The Sovereign had arrived. The HMS Sovereign was a nightmare made of steel and smoke. She was 3 times the size of the Sea Shadow. Her hull painted a deep, authoritative blue. Massive plumes of black soot billowed from her twin smokestacks, staining the pristine white ice of the north. As she approached, the sound of her steam engines echoed off the ice wall like the beating of a giant drum. "He found us," Marcus said, his voice flat with dread. "He's coming straight for the channel." "He can't fit through that doorway," Silas said, watching the massive ship through his telescope. "The Sovereign is too wide. He'll have to anchor and send boats." Suddenly, the side of the Sovereign erupted in a wall of orange flame. A second later, the roar of the cannons reached them. The water around the sea shadow exploded in giant geysers of slush and freezing foam. The Admiral wasn't sending a message. He was clearing the deck. "Return fire!" Silas roared. "Barnaby, give them a taste of the long nines." The Sea Shadow's cannons barked in response. The metal balls skipped across the ice, one of them striking the Sovereign's armored hull and bouncing off with a shower of sparks. It was like throwing stones at a fortress. "We can't win a gunfight, Silas," Elena shouted, ducking as a piece of ice shattered by a cannonball rained down on the deck. "He has 40 guns to our 6. "We don't need to win a gunfight," Silas replied, his eyes fixed on the narrow doorway in the ice wall. "We just need to get through that crack. Kalen, how fast can we move?" "The wind is picking up, but the channel is narrow." Kalen replied, "If we miss the center by an inch, we're finished." "Do it," Silas commanded. "Tilda, give us every bit of speed you can." The Sea Shadow surged forward. Behind them, the Sovereign continued its relentless bombardment. A cannonball struck the back rail of the Sea Shadow, splintering the wood and sending a sailor flying into the water. "Man overboard!" Marcus screamed. Silas didn't hesitate. He grabbed a rope and swung out over the freezing water. He caught the sailor by the collar and hauled him back onto the deck just as another explosion rocked the ship. The Sovereign was closing the gap, her iron-plated bow cutting through the floes like they were paper. "She's going to ram us!" Barnaby yelled. "Hold your positions!" Silas shouted. Just as the massive blue bow of the Sovereign loomed over them, the Sea Shadow slipped into the narrow crack at the base of the ice wall. The walls of ice on either side were so close that the sailors could touch them. The Sovereign shrieked as its wide hull ground against the entrance, unable to follow. The sound of metal twisting and groaning filled the air as the Admiral's ship was forced to a halt. They were inside the wall. The darkness swallowed them, and the sounds of the cannons faded into a heavy, rhythmic dripping of water. Inside the ice wall, the air was surprisingly warm. The darkness was absolute, save for the blue bioluminescence of the vellum map and a strange, pulsing glow from the ice walls themselves. As they moved deeper into the tunnel, the sound of the ocean disappeared, replaced by something far more unsettling. It was a sound like 1,000 voices whispering at once. It wasn't a language Silas recognized, but it had a melodic, rhythmic quality that made his head feel heavy. "Do you hear that?" Tilda asked, her hands over her ears. "It sounds like singing." "It's the singing ice," Kalen said, his voice hushed. "The air moves through the fissures in the wall, creating a natural flute. But the old stories say it's not the wind. They say the ice remembers everyone who ever drowned in these waters." "Don't listen to it," Silas ordered. "Focus on the path. Elena, what does the map say?" Elena was staring at the vellum, her eyes glazed. She didn't respond. Silas grabbed her shoulder, shaking her gently. "Elena, stay with me." She blinked, coming back to herself. "The map, it's changing, Silas. The dots are moving. It's not a map of a place anymore. It's a map of time. It's showing us when the tides will open the inner gate." The tunnel opened up into a massive underground cavern. The ceiling was a dome of clear ice, through which the faint light of the aurora borealis filtered down in shades of green and violet. In the center of the cavern sat the ruins of a city. It wasn't made of stone or wood. It was made of a dark, translucent material that looked like frozen smoke. "Oakhaven," Silas whispered. The city was beautiful and terrifying. Spirals of the dark material rose hundreds of feet into the air, connected by bridges as thin as spiderwebs. There were no lights, no people, and no sound except for the haunting whispers of the ice. "The crown is in the high spire," Kalen said, pointing to the tallest structure in the center. "But look at the water." The lake surrounding the city was perfectly still, but beneath the surface, Silas could see movement. It wasn't the sea serpent from the south. These were smaller, faster shapes, thousands of them. They looked like humans, but their skin was a pale, translucent blue, and they moved through the water with a terrifying, rhythmic grace. "The drowned," Kalen whispered. "The guardians of Oakhaven. They don't sleep, and they don't forget." Suddenly, the whispers in the air changed. The voices became louder, more urgent. The ice beneath the ship began to vibrate. "Silas," Tilda said, pointing back toward the tunnel. The Admiral didn't stop. A series of explosions rocked the cavern. The Admiral wasn't trying to fit his ship through the door. He was using his heavy cannons to blast the ice wall apart. The ceiling of the cavern began to crack, and massive shards of ice the size of houses began to fall into the dark lake. The cavern was falling apart. The Sovereign's relentless bombardment was shattering the delicate balance of the ice wall. Above them, the clear ice dome was webbed with cracks, and the aurora borealis light flickered as the structure groaned. "We have to move now," Silas shouted. "If that ceiling comes down, the lake will flash freeze and will be part of the city forever." The drowned are rising, Barnaby yelled, pointing his rifle at the water. The pale, translucent figures were breaking the surface. They didn't have weapons. They had long, spindly fingers tipped with ice-hard claws. They climbed onto the sides of the sea shadow with a chilling, silent efficiency. "Defend the ship," Silas commanded, drawing his sword. "Tilda, get the steam pipes ready. Use the heat." Tilda ran to the lower deck. She had rigged a system to divert the heat from the small galley stove through the iron plates on the hull. She opened the valves, and a blast of hot steam hissed out from the sides of the ship. The drowned let out high-pitched, rhythmic shrieks as the heat touched them. They fell back into the water, their translucent skin steaming. "It's working, but it won't last," Tilda cried. "We're running out of coal." The sea shadow moved toward the high spire. The architecture of Oakhaven was alien and sharp. As they got closer, Silas saw a landing platform made of the same dark, frozen smoke material. "I'm going in," Silas said, grabbing a heavy fur cloak and his belt of tools. "Elena, keep the ship moving. If the Admiral breaks through, don't wait for me. Take the crew and get out." "Silas, no." Elena grabbed his hand. "We do this together." "The map needs you here, Elena," Silas said, his voice soft but firm. "You're the only one who can navigate the exit once the wall collapses. Trust me." He jumped from the ship onto the platform. The ground was incredibly slippery, and the air was so cold it felt like liquid in his lungs. He ran toward the entrance of the spire, his boots making a hollow, clicking sound on the dark floor. Inside, the spire was a hollow shell. In the center, a staircase of light wound its way up toward the top. Silas began to climb. With every step, the whispers of the ice grew louder, filling his head with images of the past, his family's betrayal, the sea serpent's roar, the Admiral's cold eyes. He reached the top chamber. It was a small, circular room with a pedestal in the center. Resting on the pedestal was the Crown of Neptune. It wasn't gold. It was made of white coral and set with 3 glowing blue pearls that pulsed with the same light as the vellum map. As Silas reached for the crown, a voice echoed through the room. It wasn't a whisper this time. It was a clear, commanding tone. "You have the blood of the veins," the voice said. "But do you have the heart of the sea?" Silas turned. Standing in the shadows was the woman in the silk mask. She held a small, silver dagger, and her eyes were full of a strange, rhythmic light. "You," Silas said, his hand moving to his sword. "You're the one who gave me the map. You're the one who started this." The woman in the silk mask stepped into the light. She didn't look like a pirate or a noble now. She looked like a priestess of a forgotten age. "The Admiral is a fool," she said. "He wants the crown to rule the nations. I want the crown to save the ocean. The tides are dying, Silas. The world is becoming too warm, and the ice is melting. If the crown isn't returned to the deep, the sea shadow and everything you love will be swallowed by the rising heat." "Why me?" Silas asked. "Why not find a hero?" "Because a hero follows the rules," she replied. "The ocean needs a pirate. It needs someone who knows how to break the world to save it." A massive explosion shook the spire. The ceiling of the cavern finally gave way. A mountain of ice crashed into the lake, creating a wave that nearly capsized the sea shadow. Silas saw the ship struggling in the chaos below. "Take it," she said, pointing to the crown. "But know this, once you put it on, you will hear the sea forever. You will never know silence again." Silas didn't hesitate. He grabbed the crown. The moment his fingers touched the coral, a jolt of cold energy surged through his body. He saw the entire ocean, every current, every fish, every wreck. He saw the sovereign outside, the Admiral's face twisted in greed. "The exit is below," the woman shouted. "Under the city." There is a subterranean current that leads to the southern sea. Go!" She disappeared into the shadows as the spire began to tilt. Silas ran to the balcony and looked down. The sea shadow was directly below. "Jump!" Kaelin's voice echoed from the deck. Silas didn't think. He tucked the crown into his bag and leapt into the freezing air. He fell for what felt like an eternity before hitting the heavy canvas of the sails. He slid down the fabric and landed hard on the deck. "We have the crown!" Silas roared. "Elena, the current. It's under the spire. Dive!" The lake was now a whirlpool of ice and debris. The sea shadow headed straight for the base of the spire. A massive hole had opened in the lake bed, sucking the water down into the darkness. "Hold on!" Barnaby yelled, lashing himself to the mast. The ship tipped forward, the bow pointing straight down into the abyss. The sea shadow plummeted into the dark, subterranean river. The sound of the collapsing cavern faded, replaced by the rushing roar of water. They were no longer sailing, they were falling into the deep. The sea shadow plummeted into the lightless abyss, a leaf caught in the throat of a giant. The subterranean river was not a smooth stream. It was a chaotic, high-pressure tunnel of freezing water that roared with the sound of 1,000 cascading waterfalls. Silas clung to the main mast, his muscles screaming as the ship tilted at an impossible 45-degree angle. Around them, the darkness was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic, blue pulsing of the Crown of Neptune inside his leather bag. "Elena! Hold the line!" Silas roared, though his voice was swallowed by the crashing water. Elena had lashed herself to the steering wheel with 3 loops of heavy hemp rope. Her knuckles were white, and her face was a mask of pure determination. She wasn't steering by sight, she was steering by the feel of the current. Beside her, Kaelin used his hands to touch the wooden rail, his eyes closed. He was feeling the vibrations of the stone walls closing in. "Right. Hard right." Kaelin screamed. The ship slammed against a smooth basalt wall with a bone-jarring thud. The iron plates Tilda had installed shrieked as they sparked against the rock, sending a spray of orange light into the tunnel. The sea shadow groaned, but the blackened oak held. They were being sucked deeper into the earth, the pressure in their ears rising until it became a sharp, stabbing pain. In the hold, Tilda and Barnaby worked frantically to plug leaks. The force of the descent was forcing water through the seams of the hull. "She's taking on too much, Tilda," Barnaby shouted, throwing his weight against a wooden plug. "Pump it out or we'll sink before we see the sky." Tilda replied, her hair matted with salt and grease. Silas felt a strange sensation in his chest. It was the crown. It wasn't just glowing, it was vibrating in sync with the rushing water. Suddenly, a vision flashed in his mind, a map of the tunnel system, illuminated in lines of blue light. He saw the sharp turns, the jagged stalactites hanging from the ceiling, and the massive whirlpool ahead that served as the final gate. "Elena, move to the center," Silas commanded, his voice suddenly amplified by an unnatural resonance. "There's a drop-off in 50 yards. If we stay on the edges, the rocks will shred us." He didn't know how he knew, but Elena didn't question him. She heaved the wheel, and the sea shadow slid into the fastest part of the current. The ship accelerated, the wind whistling through the tattered rigging. Then, the floor fell away. They went over a subterranean waterfall, a vertical drop of 60 feet into a massive, glowing grotto. The sea shadow hit the pool at the bottom with a titanic splash, the water erupting in a fountain of bioluminescence. As they stabilized, Silas looked up. The ceiling of the grotto was covered in glowing crystals, casting a soft, ethereal light over the water. They were out of the narrow tunnel, but the journey was far from over. The grotto was beautiful, but the air was changing. The freezing chill of the north was being replaced by a heavy, sulphurous heat. The water, once clear and icy, was now thick with ash and bubbling with volcanic gases. They were moving south, through the roots of a mountain range that Silas realized must be the Ring of Fire. The current is slowing, Kalen noted, wiping sweat from his brow. But the temperature is rising. If we don't find an exit soon, the wood will dry out and the seams will open up. Look at the crown, Elena whispered. Silas opened his bag. The crown of Neptune was no longer pulsing blue. It was glowing a deep, angry violet. The 3 pearls at its center seemed to be absorbing the heat of the grotto. Silas reached out to touch it, and for a second, he heard the sound of 1,000 boiling vents. The crown wants to be in the deep water, Silas said. The heat is agitating it. Suddenly, a series of tremors shook the cavern. Massive boulders fell from the ceiling, crashing into the water and creating waves that rocked the sea shadow. Ahead of them, the tunnel narrowed again, but this time, the walls were glowing dull red. It was a lava tube, long drained of its molten rock but still radiating enough heat to bake a man alive. Tilda, we need more speed. Use the last of the coal. Silas ordered. We don't have coal, Silas. We burned it all in the north. Tilda shouted back from the deck. Then use the crates. Use the spare furniture. Use anything that burns. Silas commanded. We have to outrun the tremors. Barnaby and the crew began breaking apart wooden barrels and spare planks, feeding them into the small galley stove to power the steam assist pumps. The sea shadow surged forward into the glowing red tunnel. The heat was suffocating. The crew draped wet cloths over their faces, but the water was evaporating almost instantly. As they moved through the tube, the walls began to move. It wasn't just stone, it was the pressure of the earth itself. The volcano was waking up. A massive roar echoed from behind them, not the sound of water, but the sound of a pyroclastic flow. The Admiral's bombardment of the ice wall had triggered a chain reaction that was now rippling through the tectonic plates. There! Light ahead. Elena pointed. At the end of the tube was a shimmering curtain of blue. It was the ocean. But between them and the exit was a rising wall of magma. Through it. Don't stop. Silas yelled. The sea shadow crashed through the curtain of water, the steam from the encounter creating a blinding white cloud. They emerged into the open sea, the cool salt air hitting them like a blessing. But as the steam cleared, Silas saw that they weren't alone. Waiting for them in the calm, tropical waters was the HMS Sovereign. The Sovereign looked like a ghost of her former self. Her blue paint was scorched. One of her smokestacks was bent at a sharp angle, and her forward hull was dented from the ice. But her guns were still intact. 40 heavy cannons were leveled at the sea shadow, their black muzzles glinting in the afternoon sun. Admiral Julian Vane stood on the bridge, his telescope trained on Silas. He looked older, his face etched with a fury that went beyond duty. He had lost his pride in the ice, and he intended to take it back with blood. He beat us here, Marcus whispered, his hand trembling on the hilt of his sword. He must have sailed around the ice wall while we were in the tunnels. He's desperate, Silas said. He knows he can't go back to London empty-handed. He needs that crown to justify the ships he's lost. A signal flag went up on the Sovereign. Surrender or be destroyed. What do we do, Silas? Elena asked. Her hands were still on the wheel, but she was looking at him for a miracle. Silas looked at the crown in his bag. He felt the weight of it, the psychic hum that was now a constant melody in his mind. He realized that the crown wasn't just a relic. It was a weapon. But it was a weapon that required a price. Every time he touched it, he felt a piece of his human memory slip away, replaced by the vast, cold history of the sea. I'm going to talk to him, Silas said. He'll kill you the moment you step on his deck. Barnaby protested. No, he won't. He wants the crown, and he knows I'm the only one who can unlock its power, Silas replied. Lower the small boat. I'm going alone. Silas rowed himself across the quiet water between the two ships. The silence was heavy, broken only by the rhythmic creaking of the Sovereign's hull. As he reached the side of the massive warship, a rope ladder was lowered. Silas climbed up and stepped onto the deck. He was immediately surrounded by 20 Marines with bayonets. They looked tired and hungry, their uniforms stained with salt. Admiral Julian Vane walked toward him, his boots clicking on the iron-reinforced deck. "You look like a beggar, Silas," the Admiral said, his voice a cold rasp. "Is this what your freedom has brought you? A broken ship and a crew of thieves?" "I have the crown, Julian," Silas said, ignoring the insult. "And I know what it does. If you fire those guns, you'll trigger a tidal wave that will sink this ship before the first ball hits us. The crown protects the sea, and right now, I am the sea." "You are a traitor and a pirate," Julian spat. "Give me the crown, and I will let your crew live. You will return to London in chains, but they will be free." "You're lying," Silas said calmly. "You'll kill them to hide the fact that a pirate did your job for you. But it doesn't matter. The crown isn't for you." Silas reached into his bag and pulled out the Crown of Neptune. The moment it was exposed to the open air, the sky began to turn a deep, bruised purple. The water around the Sovereign began to churn, not with waves, but with a rhythmic, pulsing vibration. The Crown of Neptune began to sing. It wasn't a sound heard with the ears. It was a vibration that resonated in the marrow of every man on the deck. The Marines dropped their rifles, their hands over their ears. The Admiral stumbled back, his face turning a sickly shade of grey. "What are you doing?" Julian screamed. "Stop this madness." Silas didn't answer. He was no longer entirely himself. His eyes had turned a brilliant, glowing blue, and his skin felt as cold as the ice of Oakhaven. He lifted the crown above his head. "The ocean does not belong to kings." Silas's voice boomed, echoing with the power of 1,000 storms. "It does not belong to empires. It belongs to the deep." In the water surrounding the Sovereign, massive shapes began to rise. They weren't the drowned or the sea serpent. They were the old ones, colossal whales with skin like barnacled stone, and giant squids with eyes the size of wagon wheels. They circled the Admiral's ship, their movements creating a massive whirlpool that began to pull the Sovereign down into the water. "Silas, stop. You're killing us all." Elena's voice reached him from the sea shadow. Silas looked toward his ship. He saw his crew, his family, watching him with terror. He realized that the crown was consuming him. It was using his anger and his pain to fuel its defense of the ocean. If he didn't stop, the whirlpool would swallow both ships, and he would become a permanent part of the crown's legend. "Julian," Silas said, turning back to his uncle. The Admiral was on his knees, his eyes wide with a realization of his own insignificance. "Go back to your world. Tell them the north is closed. Tell them the sea has a king, and he doesn't take orders." Silas lowered the crown. The singing stopped instantly. The massive creatures of the deep sank back into the darkness, and the whirlpool flattened out into a gentle swell. The sky cleared, the purple clouds dissolving into a bright, clear blue. The Marines scrambled to their feet, looking at Silas as if he were a god. Silas walked to the edge of the deck and looked down at his small boat. "This is the only mercy you'll get, Uncle," Silas said. "If I see a Navy flag in these waters again, I won't stop the crown." He rowed back to the sea shadow. As he stepped onto the deck, his crew backed away, their eyes full of a new kind of respect, and a touch of fear. Elena was the only one who approached him. She looked at his eyes, which were slowly fading back to their natural brown. "Are you still there, Silas?" she asked softly. "I'm here," he whispered, his voice trembling. "But the crown is heavy. Elena, we need to finish this. We need to get to the trench." The journey to the abyssal trench, the deepest part of the Southern Ocean, took 3 days. The sea shadow was a shadow of her former self, her wood groaning with every wave, but she moved with a new kind of grace. The water seemed to push her forward, the currents aligning to speed her path. But peace was a fragile thing. On the second night, a shadow moved through the lower decks. Barnaby was the first to find the body. It was Marcus, the first officer. He was slumped against a barrel of salted beef, a silver dagger buried in his chest. The same kind of dagger the woman in the silk mask had carried. Silas. Marcus is dead. Barnaby's roar woke the ship. Silas ran to the hold, his heart sinking. He looked at Marcus's face, frozen in a look of surprise. He looked at the dagger. It wasn't just silver. It was etched with the symbol of the weeping eye. "She's on the ship," Tilda whispered, her hand on her pistol. "The woman from the spire." "I told you she wasn't a friend," Silas said, his voice cold. "She didn't want the crown saved. She wanted it for herself. She just used me to get it out of the ice." A rhythmic tapping came from the darkness of the aft hold. Silas turned, his sword drawn. The woman in the silk mask stepped out from behind a pile of canvas. She wasn't wearing her silk dress anymore. She was in leather armor, and she held a second silver dagger. "You are a good tool, Silas Vane," she said, her voice devoid of emotion. "But the Crown of Neptune is too powerful for a pirate. It belongs to the Order of the Eye. We have watched the tides for 1,000 years, waiting for the return of the heart." "You killed Marcus," Silas said, stepping toward her. "He was a good man." "He was a witness," she replied, "just as the rest of your crew will be." She moved with a speed that was almost supernatural. She didn't attack Silas. She dived for the bag containing the crown. Tilda fired her pistol, but the woman twisted in midair, the ball whistling harmlessly into the wood. Barnaby lunged with his heavy beam, but she slid under his strike and kicked his legs out from under him. Silas met her in the center of the hold. Their blades clashed, creating a shower of sparks that illuminated the dark space. She was a master of the rapier, her movements fluid and rhythmic. Silas fought with the raw, heavy style of a sailor, using his strength to push her back. "The crown doesn't want you," Silas shouted, parrying a strike aimed at his throat. "The crown wants power." She screamed. She managed to grab the bag. But the moment her fingers touched the leather, the crown let out a burst of white light. It wasn't a pulse of protection. It was a rejection. The woman was thrown back against the hull, her silver mask shattering as she hit the wood. Beneath the mask, her face was not human. Her skin was covered in the same translucent scales as the drowned. "You're one of them," Silas said, looking at her in horror. "I am the last of the city," she hissed, her eyes glowing yellow. She tried to rise, but the sea shadow gave a sudden, violent lurch. They had reached the edge of the abyssal trench. The trench was not just a hole in the ocean floor. It was a doorway to the core of the world. The water here was a deep, midnight blue, and the pressure was so great that the sea shadow's hull began to creak with a rhythmic, high-pitched whine. But they weren't alone. The Sovereign appeared on the horizon, her engines screaming as she pushed herself to her absolute limit. Admiral Julian Vane had ignored Silas's warning. He had followed them, driven by a madness that had consumed his duty. "He's not stopping," Elena shouted from the wheel. "He's going to ram us into the trench." "Let him come," Silas said, standing on the deck with the crown in his hand. He looked at the woman in the leather armor, who was now tied to the mast by Barnaby. She was staring at the water with a look of pure longing. The Sovereign loomed over them, her massive steel bow cutting through the water like a guillotine. Julian stood at the very front, his sword raised. "This ends now, Silas," he roared. As the Sovereign made contact with the sea shadow's stern, Silas put the Crown of Neptune on his head. The world went silent. The sound of the engines, the wind, and the screaming sailors vanished. Silas felt the immense weight of the ocean pressing down on him, but it didn't hurt. He felt the life of every creature in the trench. He saw the ancient city at the bottom, the true Oakhaven, where the kings of old still slept in golden tombs. Silas raised his hands. The water of the trench didn't rise, it opened. A massive chasm appeared in the sea, a mile wide and 5 miles deep. The sovereign, caught in the sudden void, tipped forward and began a long, slow fall into the abyss. "Silas! Help us!" The admiral's voice reached him, thin and desperate. Silas looked at his uncle. He saw the man who had destroyed his family's name for the sake of a flag. He saw the greed that had nearly ended the world. "The sea has no mercy for kings," Silas said. The sovereign disappeared into the darkness of the chasm, the sound of her hull imploding echoing like a distant thunder. The chasm closed as quickly as it had opened, the water rushing back together in a massive explosion of foam. The admiral and his iron ship were gone, swallowed by the very deep they had tried to conquer. The sea shadow survived, held in a bubble of calm water by the power of the crown. But the ship was dying. The wood was splintering, and the sails were gone. "We have to drop it, Silas," Elena said, her voice shaking. "You have to let it go." Silas stood at the edge of the deck. He looked down into the dark water of the trench. He could feel the crown trying to pull him down with it. It wanted him to stay, to become the new guardian of the deep. It offered him immortality, the power to rule the tides, and a memory that would last as long as the world. But then he looked at Elena. He saw the salt spray on her cheeks and the light of the sun in her eyes. He looked at Barnaby and Tilda, who were standing together, watching him with a mixture of love and sadness. He realized that the sea was a beautiful place to visit, but it was a cold place to live. "I'm a pirate," Silas whispered to the crown, "and a pirate needs the wind." He took the crown off his head. The blue light in his eyes vanished, replaced by the warm, tired brown of a man who had seen too much. He felt a sudden, crushing weight of exhaustion fall over him. "Go home," Silas said, his voice a ragged whisper. He dropped the Crown of Neptune into the abyssal trench. As it fell, the crown began to glow with a brilliant, golden light. It didn't sink like a stone, it drifted down like a falling star. Thousands of glowing fish rose from the deep to meet it, forming a shimmering procession that followed the relic down into the darkness. The ocean itself seemed to let out a long, contented sigh. The woman tied to the mast began to weep. It wasn't a sound of sadness, but of relief. Her translucent scales began to fade, her skin turning back to the soft bronze of a human. The curse of Oakhaven was broken. "The balance is restored," she said, her voice finally human. "The tides will stay. The ice will hold. You have saved us all, Silas Vane." The sea shadow began to rise. The bubble of calm water lifted them back to the surface. As they broke the waves, the sun was setting, painting the sky in colors of gold and fire. The ocean was calm, a vast, flat mirror that reflected the glory of the heavens. They were alone on the sea. No navy ships, no pirates, no monsters, just a broken ship and a crew of legends. The sea shadow did not return to Tortuga. She was too damaged for the long voyage, and Silas knew that the Navy would be looking for them, even with the Admiral gone. Instead, they sailed for a small, unnamed island in the southern reaches, a place of white sand, green palms, and a lagoon so clear you could see the shadows of the clouds on the bottom. They ran the ship onto the beach for the last time. The wood groaned as it settled into the sand, the blackened oak finally finding peace. They spent a month on the island, using the remains of the ship to build a small village. They lived off the fruit of the trees and the fish of the lagoon. Tilda used her skills to build a windmill for fresh water, and Barnaby became the finest builder of huts the southern sea had ever seen. The woman from the spire, whose name they learned was Lyra, stayed with them for a time. She taught them the stories of the stars and the secrets of the plants. Then, one night, She walked into the water and did not come back. Silas liked to think she had found her way to a new home, somewhere beneath the waves. One evening, Silas and Elena sat on the porch of their small home, watching the moon rise over the ocean. The golden coin, now just a piece of metal, hung around Silas's neck on a leather cord. "Do you miss it?" Elena asked, leaning her head on his shoulder. "The race. The danger." Silas looked at the horizon. He could still hear the faint, rhythmic song of the tides in the back of his mind, a lingering gift from the crown. He could feel the pulse of the ocean and the movement of the whales 1,000 miles away. "Sometimes," Silas admitted, "but then I remember the cold of the ice and the weight of the crown. And I think I'd rather have the smell of jasmine and the sound of your voice." He took her hand, his fingers interlaced with hers. "The world thinks we're dead, Elena. The admiral, the jewel, the crown. They're all just stories now. Myths for sailors to tell in the taverns of Tortuga." "A good story is better than gold, Silas," she said with a smile. "Maybe," Silas replied. "But a good life is better than a story." As the stars appeared in the sky, forming the shape of the great albatross, Silas Vane closed his eyes. He wasn't a captain anymore, and he wasn't a legend. He was just a man, finally at rest, in a world where the sea was at peace. The sea shadow sat on the beach, a silent monument to their journey. Over the years, the vines would cover her wood, and the sand would fill her hold. But her spirit would always remain, a reminder that even in a world of kings and empires, a few brave souls had dared to follow the heart of the sea.